Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of May 30th, 2021. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I'm the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. With us today, we have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and we have on our panel our members Jason Geringer and Brent Ellman. And our special guest today is a person whom I consider to be one of the most articulate spokespersons for the transhumanist movement and the ideas of transhumanism. Ryan O'Shea is an entrepreneur and futurist speaker from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is the host of Future Grind, a multimedia production company that seeks to increase techno-literacy and democratize access to information about emerging technologies, enabling more voices to be part of the societal conversation surrounding technology. Ryan is also a founder of the Human Augmentation Institute, an organization focused on upholding bodily autonomy and ensuring that any efforts in human augmentation are done ethically, safely, and responsibly. He also serves as the spokesperson for Grindhouse Wetware, a group specializing in technology to augment human capabilities. In 2017, Ryan co-founded a National Institutes of Health and National Science Foundation supported artificial intelligence startup that is working to use machine learning and automated just-in-time intervention for behavior change. Ryan has represented NASA and Caltech's Jet Propulsion Laboratory as a solar system ambassador and serves both as a World Economic Forum global shaper and an ambassador for Pittsburgh AI. He is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and currently serves on the boards of multiple nonprofit organizations. So that is quite an impressive background and set of activities you are engaged in. We're always pleased to speak with you, Ryan. And as our first question for you, I'm curious how you became interested in transhumanism in the first place and what led you to be involved in the transhumanist movement.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm a big fan of these virtual enlightenment salons. I think they cover great topics, and I'm excited to be participating in this one. So I have always thought growing up that humans would eventually use science and technology to overcome our limitations, to overcome things such as diseases and death or travel the solar system. I just always thought this future was far off and that I was born too early to be a part of that. And then as I was graduating college in 2012, I started to discover this online community, first of biohackers that were taking technology into their own hands, perhaps sometimes literally, and building the future using technology that they wanted to overcome their limitations. And that led me to the transhumanist community online. And I found out that other people had these same ideas that I did, and they were interested in not only talking about that future and thinking about what it might be like, but actively working to build it, to extend the human lifespan, to do all of these things that I was passionate about, but thought was beyond my reach. And as soon as I found out that existed, probably in the mid 2010s at this point, I knew I had to get deeply involved in this community. And that's what I've done since then. First with Grindhouse Wetware, which does some of these works with implantables. And that led to the formation of the Future Grind podcast. And now I do work with various organizations working in the transhumanist science and technology fields.
Excellent. And since that time, of course, you have been quite prolific in the transhumanist community. It's astonishing to think that 9 years have now passed since 2012. I myself was introduced to the transhumanist movement in 2004. And prior to that, I had quite a similar outlook to your own in that I considered these types of advancements for humanity, both in terms of life extension and augmentation of human capabilities, to be highly desirable, but perhaps centuries away. And I was rather disappointed. I felt the way Benjamin Franklin felt in the 18th century when he said that he laments that he was born too soon. But the work of such thinkers as Aubrey de Grey, Ray Kurzweil, Max More, led me to think that perhaps these advancements are attainable within our lifetimes. And even the possibility of this, the technical feasibility, if we allow this technology to progress, is, I think, enough to motivate a person of my mindset and your mindset to really get involved and see if we can bring that future about. So I'm curious, since 9 years is a long time, what have you observed with regard to the evolution of the transhumanist movement since you first became aware of it?
Well, just to touch very quickly on something you said there when you brought up Benjamin Franklin, I know in some of his writings, he actually thought about the possibility of preserving humans for future reanimation. His idea was to preserve them in alcohol. So he was thinking about these things back then. And of course, we're doing things today with cryonics, which we don't know yet will really be successful or not, but we are thinking about these things in the same way that Benjamin Franklin was. And Benjamin Franklin is one of those thinkers that I wish could have been preserved, because I think he would have so much to offer us today. And every day that we aren't pursuing these technologies and that we don't have them developed, we are losing minds that could be there in the future with us. So I think that adds some urgency to this work that's happening. Now, to directly answer your question about how I've seen things change and how I viewed the movement over the past 9 years, speaking specifically about biohacking, since that was the first part of it I got into, the reason that I reached out to Grindhouse Wetware to get involved with them was because they were based in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I saw that they were getting some press attention for the work that they were doing with kind of like implants that go in the body to monitor the health metrics of the body. The one that was popular at that time was about temperature. And I noticed that a lot of the press attention they were getting was focusing on the taboo aspects of what they were doing, that it was dangerous and bizarre and scary. And in the before 2015, I would say that's what most of the coverage of that type of work was like in the popular media. And that's one of the things that led me to starting the Future Grind podcast, because I wanted to have those conversations internally. And after around 2016, I would say, I noticed a shift that the coverage of biohacking stopped sensationalizing it in terms of this is bizarre and weird and gross, and started talking about it as though it was the future, that these people were on the cutting edge, and this is what would happen to everyone at some point in the future. We would be augmenting ourselves with this technology. And that change happened in a few short years, which was, I think, very great to see. And I think it really is a generational shift. I think if you look at polls, the younger generations think about human augmentation and bodily autonomy issues very differently than many of the members of the older generations do. So I think the societal shift is happening, and I am very excited to see that. The one thing that I think kind of brought me back down to earth a little bit is that when I first got involved in this community, I was sure that this technology was right around the corner. If you'd have asked me in 2014 what I imagined 2021 to look like, I would have thought we would have been more advanced today than we are in terms of some of these things. But I realized that a lot of the barriers to the progress isn't inherently or necessarily technological at this point. A lot of it is willpower and governmental and regulatory. And there's a lot of other obstacles that are holding us back from, I think, the future that many of us here on this live stream and many of us in general want to see happen. And I want to focus the societal conversations on bringing us towards that goal and recognizing it and actively working towards it. So that's kind of what I'm focusing my work on today with Future Grind and with my work with the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation, is really getting people to understand the importance of these goals, the benefits of them, and agreeing to work with us to bring them about.
Yes, indeed. And you highlighted the importance of advocacy there. I think that has also been a shift within the transhumanist movement from a kind of earlier, almost inevitablist perspective that was fairly widespread in the first decade of this century, where people would point to the exponential growth trajectories that Ray Kurzweil, for instance, noted in his book, The Singularity is Near. And they made statements like, well, it's only a matter of a few decades, so the real goal is just for us to try to survive for as long as possible. The problem is, of course, as you mentioned, societal and political factors can get in the way. We've actually had a lot of the technology for autonomous vehicles for a long time, but one of the barriers has been the cultural reluctance of many people to adopt them, and that is combined with media sensationalism. Whenever there's any accident involving an autonomous vehicle, even if it's not in autonomous mode and human error or human neglect is responsible for the accident, the media will highlight it as some sort of great tragedy attributable to autonomous vehicles, and yet 40,000 people die from manually driven vehicles every year in the United States, and there's almost silence on that matter from the media. So there does seem to be this built-in status quo bias affecting both the mindsets of a lot of people and institutions as well. There's institutional sluggishness. There are regulations, statutes that were developed with the context of an earlier time in mind, when this kind of progress was not on the horizon for many policymakers. And I think in the meantime, transhumanists have become more organized. Hence, we do have the US Transhumanist Party, which tries to involve itself in these political conversations. So what do you think it would take for transhumanist advocacy to become mainstream? Because it seems to me it's not that there's a lot of public hostility to transhumanism. The issue is more one of unawareness. Most people still haven't heard the term transhumanism, and most people still don't have this systematic way of thinking about the potential of these emerging technologies. So how can that change? How can we reach an inflection point where in the minds of a lot of fairly ordinary people, transhumanism is as familiar as, for instance, environmentalism would be?
I think that transhumanism is and will continue to be a moving bar. I think if you were to ask someone in the 1850s what transhumanist technologies might look like, they would describe the way that we're communicating right now and the medical advances that we have right now. But many of us don't consider us broadcasting through YouTube and talking live over thousands of miles as transhumanist technologies. But in many ways, of course they are. So I think that's how it's going to be going forward. The things that transhumanists are talking about today, lab-grown organs, perhaps mind uploading at some point, lifespan extension, curing aging or reversing it in some cases. I think these things are slowly going to happen over time. And once they do happen, they're not going to be considered transhumanism once they reach the broad public. They're just going to be the forefront of science and technology and the exciting new thing. And I think in that future in which people are going to clinics to get augmented limbs or CRISPR their genes or de-age themselves with whatever new treatment is out, I think the US Transhumanist Party might still exist. And I think Humanity Plus and other organizations or philosophers might still exist and be doing very similar work to what they're doing today, but they'll still be looking into the future. They'll be looking at the next big thing. So transhumanism in that future won't be referring to augmenting your limbs and de-aging yourself. It will be referring to colonizing beyond the solar system, perhaps, or something else. I think that bar of transhumanism is always moving. And I think that's fine. I think that's good. The one problem I could see with that is that transhumanists might never be able to claim victory, right? Because we're always talking about the next thing, and that next thing is never actually attained, because by the point that it is, we're talking about something else. And I think that's fine. I think we need to always be pushing that forward. And that when we're all adopting, we're moving from giant room-sized computers to desktop computers to laptops and then to phones and then The Apple Watch was on our wrists, and I think the next step is inside our bodies. And if you ask anyone today, I think technology inside our bodies doing what an Apple Watch does would be considered transhumanist technology. In 20 years, I don't think it will.
And this is interesting because one of the principles of extropy that Max More formulated in the early 1990s is perpetual progress, the idea that we don't stop. There's not just some fixed goal that we reach, and once we reach it, we're done. It's about continued expansion of our capabilities, continually making life better, more interesting, more filled with possibility. And we were both on a live stream of the Break the Rules show, a very interesting live stream where first there was a reverse debate, and I got to hear you make arguments in opposition of transhumanism, and then another of the participants who went by the pseudonym Weird Hiker, who is an opponent of transhumanism, at least he thinks he is, was trying to make arguments in favor of transhumanism. And then we had a debrief and discussion afterward, which was quite interesting. But a lot of the other panelists on that show had reservations about transhumanism because they considered it to be a utopian ideology. And I pointed out that really a static utopia is not what transhumanism envisions. A better term may be extropia, stemming from the principles of extropy, which is a situation of continuous improvement where there is no end state, but people do progressively get better and they progressively solve an ever larger array of problems. So do you think that it may be possible at some future time for people to look back a few decades and say, well, these transhumanists, they were onto something? Just as if we are honest about the contributions of earlier transhumanists like FM 2030, we could look back at some of their prognostications, for instance, his idea of telepresence, and realize, well, we are acting in this way right now. We are engaged in telepresence. So do you think it's likely that, say, circa 2050, people will look back at the transhumanist community of 2021 and say, these people were onto something. They saw possibilities that most people still didn't recognize or didn't accept at the time?
I would hope so. And I think that's quite likely that that would be the case. My only thought is, for example, it would be hard to divorce you from the transhumanist movement because it's so tied up to your chairmanship of the US Transhumanist Party and other organizations. For other thinkers that are active in the transhumanist community today, but that have other labels attached to them, I wonder if those people in 2050 will look back at them not as transhumanists, but as that other thing that they were, as AI developers and ethicists or technologists or political thinkers. I wonder if one of those labels might be the ones that stick to them. And I'm not sure exactly how that might play out. The only reason I say that is because, like the points I already made, they won't consider those technologies that have come to pass as transhumanism at that point. So they might not even look back at Ray Kurzweil, for example, as a transhumanist thinker when things have already happened that he predicted. At that point, it's not transhumanism anymore. That could be one way we go about it, and it ends up happening. But I would hope that the thinkers of today are given the credit that they are due when they are eventually proven right, which I certainly think that they will be. And at the beginning of that question, you brought up the Break the Rules live stream. I just want to comment on that a little bit. I think that those exercises of playing devil's advocate and still manning the opposition's arguments is one of the most important things that we can do. I know that playing devil's advocate has a very bad name in society today, and I don't understand that at all. I think it's one of the most important roles that we can play in a debate or an argument. And I think framing the best possible argument of your opponents is the best way to reaffirm or rationalize your beliefs and to overcome their objections to it. So I think the work that's going on with live streams such as that are very important. And I think that's something that should continue both in our movements and outside of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I thought you did an excellent job in that debate, in that in making arguments against transhumanism, you also accurately represented transhumanism and what it stands for. It's so commonplace in my experience to hear critics of transhumanism attacking a straw man, essentially. And that straw man could arise from the conspiracy theorist alt-right. Many of those individuals think we're lizard men Illuminati who are secretly in control of the world's institutions. I can assure you I have not even received a single phone call from the Illuminati saying, well, Mr. Stoliarov, what do you need from us? Do you need legions of unthinking followers? Do you need vast amounts of money? What can we do to help you in achieving world domination? No, they have not reached out to me at all, not even once. I sometimes do receive spam emails, and one of them did come from the Illuminati a number of years ago, at least ostensibly. It was a really humorous email signed by the Illuminati, but it's just such a ridiculous misconception. And then you have on the bio-Luddite, neo-Malthusian left, people accusing transhumanists of just riding roughshod over the environment or upsetting some purported natural balance of things or defying human nature in some way. And again, that's a mischaracterization of transhumanism, because transhumanists aren't opposed to environmental preservation or cleaner technologies or finding a way, for instance, to preserve endangered species or reduce the amount of pollution. It's just that we think the only way to solve environmental crises is to move forward technologically, not to move backward. But you, in the arguments that you made, bypassed, of course, those mischaracterizations. And I'm curious, looking back at that debate, what do you think is the strongest, most plausible argument against transhumanism that we have to seriously confront and find reasonable rebuttals to?
So I am a transhumanist. So obviously I think that transhumanism has at least adequate answers to all of the points I brought up against it. But at the same time, the points that I brought up against transhumanism were things that I really do honestly feel could potentially be shortcomings and are things that we should be thinking about. One of those examples that I brought up is, are humans adequately able to usher in a positive future with technology as we think that we are? I brought up in that debate, I mentioned that many of the existential risks that we are currently facing, whether it's climate change or man-made pathogens or gray goo or runaway AGI, all of these things are examples of science and technology getting away from us and eventually perhaps becoming an existential risk for us. And you bring up things like the Fermi paradox, where mathematically, statistically, I would expect that we would see intelligent alien life out there. And we don't see that. And could the reason for that be a great filter in which all of these civilizations that came before us inevitably develop some technology that ends up being their downfall? I think it's quite likely that that is the case, that there is a technology, whether it's nanomachines or pathogens or AGI or something on the horizon that we can't even imagine yet, that ultimately leads to the downfall of many civilizations. How do we make sure we don't fall victim to that same thing? That's a major concern that I have. And I think that if that reality were to come true, transhumanists might be on the cutting edge of completely eliminating our species, which I'm sure is not the goal of this at all. And I appreciate that transhumanists are among the people having these conversations about these topics and really exploring them of how do we implement AI safety? How do we make sure there aren't autonomous weapon systems being used? Or if they are being used, how do we make sure they don't get out of hand? These are the conversations that I think we need to continue having because they are very important to have. So that's the major criticism that I think I might have of transhumanism, just making sure that we're not actually ushering in our demise in an attempt to usher in a positive future.
Well, the third core ideal of the US Transhumanist Party is the support for science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate the existential risks facing our species. And this is a question I ask any scholar of existential risk with whom I discuss this subject. What do you think is the greatest existential risk facing the human species today?
That's a hard one. I'm not necessarily someone who studies these questions deeply. I think that climate change is very important, but I don't think it's an existential risk. I think it could set us back. I don't think it would wipe us out. I think that what might wipe us out might be a man made pathogen, for example. I think we've seen how something like COVID-19, which is relatively safe compared to many other diseases that already exist in terms of transmissibility and lethality. If you were to manufacture an illness significantly more dangerous than COVID-19, I think you could not only just wipe out much of humanity, but completely destroy our economic and political system in the process. That's a major concern that I have, especially when it comes to the democratization and access to science and technology, which is something I'm very much for, but we also have to consider the risks that go along with that. And I personally am very libertarian minded. I think that people should have access to whatever information and tools that they can. And I'm very skeptical of authority figures barring them from that information or those tools. And I wonder really that I'm going to have to come up with some questions for myself at some point because I really don't want every unhinged person in the world to have a desktop printer capable of creating lethal pathogens that we have no response to. And that's something that I think transhumanists in general need to think about very strongly and come up with a plan for.
Yes, and I think this is quite a valid set of points that you made. In our YouTube chat, Dan Elton points out that global warming is not an existential risk because it cannot wipe out all humans. And as you pointed out, humankind would be able to survive destructive climate change just in a suboptimal condition. However, climate change could lead to global destabilization, which would increase actual existential risks like nuclear, AI, and bio risk. And you spoke about bio risk. It's also interesting that Ray Kurzweil himself had made a statement that he opposed efforts to publicly release the genetic sequence of the 1918 Spanish influenza virus because he was concerned about what would happen if somebody chose to genetically re-engineer that virus and release it into the wild. And of course, there are virology labs right now that contain these specimens of microorganisms from prior pandemics, and they try to study them, understand what made them so virulent, but there are concerns about the safety of those kinds of facilities and what would happen if somebody just accidentally fails to follow a safety protocol and a few of these microorganisms get out into the broader population. So where would you draw the line, if there is a line to be drawn with regard to such research? Are there any activities where we should say, for the sake of the safety of the general public, there are certain virology studies that should not be conducted?
So I'm skeptical of moratoriums because I think that moratoriums just push all the research underground and make sure that it still happens just outside of the public eye. And if work is going to happen, I think it should happen within the public eye and be transparent. So that's why when it comes to things like such as human germline editing, for example, there was a lot of talk about a moratorium on that type of work. I am fully against that. When it comes to things like gain of function research for pathogens that could wipe out humanity, we really need to consider what road we want to go down there. I mean, we've had leaks already from some of the most secure biolabs in the world. These things can and likely will escape, and we need to prepare for that. I would not advise that anyone undertake gain of function research for these viruses that could have these ultimate outcomes on humanity. At the same time, I don't want to put a blanket statement that we ban that or that we can't do it, because I think it could have some value in terms of developing medicine or vaccines against these pathogens, or that, like I said, we would just end up pushing it underground where I don't want it to be regardless. So I don't pretend to have all of the answers here, and I would be skeptical of myself prescribing anything going forward because I would want to bounce those ideas off of people. And that's why I think that platforms like this one here are important, where we can have those hard and difficult conversations that really are not pleasant to have, but that we need to have. But I don't have a clear answer of a line that I would draw other than that I am skeptical of moratoriums, but I also wouldn't suggest that people undertake that research.
Yes, and this is, of course, a difficult balance to strike because, as you pointed out, the knowledge gained could be valuable for defensive purposes, for fighting any naturally occurring pathogens that arise. Now, I wonder if there could be some sort of condition associated with this research, that if you explore gain of function of a virus, you have to simultaneously construct highly effective capabilities of neutralizing that virus, essentially right away. And I am thinking of other situations where, in various arms races in history, unfortunately, the offensive capabilities developed first and the defensive capabilities followed them. We're seeing that with nuclear weapons, for instance, where the ability to destroy all life on Earth was developed first, and missile defense systems are still fairly young. One could say they're still in experimental stages, but ideally, the order of operations would have been reversed. And before embarking on the development of any nuclear missile, human governments and societies should have been confident that they had the capability to shoot them down reliably if they needed to. Even if they thought of ever using them in warfare, what if there had been a mistake? What if there had been a miscalculation on the part of one great power and it launched nuclear missiles at another great power and then realized, oh, this is a mistake. We're sorry. We want to take it back. Please shoot down our missiles. Today, it would still be an uncertain proposition that this could even happen. Of course, even as far back as the 1950s and the 1960s, various films were devoted to that kind of premise. So do you think there's a path forward with some sort of matching of defensive capabilities every time a new technology with potentially destructive consequences is developed? And the idea would be the very same researchers, the very same facilities should have enough defensive capabilities to neutralize any threat that arises.
I think that's a great way to go about it. I think it would be wise for us to do that work to make sure that we can match whatever technology is being created and try to contain it if needed. I think the other point that I would make is I brought up the idea earlier of everyone in the world having this bioprinter on their desk that can make whatever medicine or pathogens, whatever they want to make. And I mentioned the danger of that, that a single unhinged person could cause immense damage. I want to bring up the reverse of that too, which is that right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, you had a very small minority of people with the with a combination of the technical know-how and the resources and ability to manufacture a vaccine that could combat that virus. In the future of these desktop printers, sure, one person could do something wrong, but I think billions of people could have the opportunity to, at home, develop something to counteract that. You have more minds, more people, and more resources working to solve the problem rather than in the last year, we saw a vast majority of the population was stuck at home, unable to do much of anything to combat this risk that we were all facing, leaving all of the work to the hands of essentially a few. I don't want to see that. The more that we could crowdsource answers to these problems and delegate the work so they have more ideas and more thoughts, I think that most humans are generally good and would use this technology for good. And I think that the more people we have on team good than the team that wants to do harm, the safer we'll all be. So I think that's one way to think about it as well.
Yes, indeed. And I've often responded in this way to existential risk concerns as well, expressing the hope that there are more researchers and innovators who are concerned about safety and who do want only the positive uses of the technologies and who would have the means to counter the relatively small number of rogue actors. And I hope that that remains the case. Now, we have a number of questions that have arisen throughout this conversation already. And Jason Geringer is interested to know if you could ask Ben Franklin a question, what would it be?
So I think in this scenario, I would like to bring Ben Franklin to the present and essentially show him the United States government as it's operating today and ask him, is this at all what you had in mind? And how can we fix it to make it better? I think that's one of the major questions that I would have to him. And I would think that he would be very much unhappy with what he's seeing today as our state of American politics. And I think he'd have some great ideas that hopefully we'd be able to implement.
That's a way better question than what I was thinking.
Yes, that is a great question for Benjamin Franklin. And it's clear to me as well that unfortunately, the American experiment has greatly departed from what Benjamin Franklin and many of his contemporaries in the founding generation envisioned. And along these lines, we have a question from Ahmed Bouzid, who asks, how can we introduce radical innovation in the political sphere? Of course, this is a matter of great interest to the US Transhumanist Party.
I think the first and easiest thing that might help a lot is ranked choice voting. I think that would help minor political parties, such as perhaps the US Transhumanist Party, gain a foothold so we don't have these votes that I think we had both in 2016, 2018, and 2020 of voting for the lesser of two evils in many occasions. I want to have more options for people. I want to have more political parties. I think that would greatly help out our process. That's the quickest and easiest one I think that would be to implement. Beyond that, I think liquid democracy, in which essentially every human has a vote, well, every citizen of the country would have a vote on the topics that are being discussed, and that your vote could be delegated to someone who you view as a subject matter expert in a particular topic, and they could delegate both of your vote and their vote to someone else. So essentially, if a piece of legislation comes up with the topic of the economy, most of the voting power would be delegated to people who are recognized as experts in that field. I think that politicians do some great work, and I think we don't give them credit for a lot of that. But at the same time, they are domain experts in one, maybe two subjects, and they are trying to talk about foreign policy and economics and the future of science and technology and health policy. And it's not reasonable to expect them to be able to do that. I think delegating these votes to subject matter experts within those domains is one of the most intelligent things we can do. And another idea comes up within liquid democracy, which might be delegating your vote to a non-human. So perhaps an AI is developed with an expertise in a particular area and runs statistical modeling or various simulations to see what the outcome might be. You could delegate your vote to that AI system to vote for you on perhaps an economic policy issue. So these are the things that I think we might want to start thinking about now that could solve a lot of the problems that we have. And I want to be clear that I think the US government is probably among the best in the world. I think the Constitution that we have is amazing. I think that it's withstood the test of time remarkably well. I think it's one of the best governing documents that's ever been created, but we can't expect for it to remain static and unchanging into the future. We need to think about changes that make us more adaptable and able to succeed going forward. But let's not throw out the whole thing wholesale. Let's really look at what's working and change what's not.
Yes, indeed. And of course, I would echo your comments on ranked preference voting, since the US Transhumanist Party uses it internally and also advocates for it within its platform. And now states such as Maine and Alaska have recently implemented it as a result of popular referenda. So hopefully the political situation in those states will become a bit more diverse and more representative of a broader variety of political parties. Now, it's also interesting that you mentioned this concept of liquid democracy and the delegation of votes to subject matter experts. Right now in the political system, lobbyists have an undue amount of influence because lobbyists tend to portray themselves as having some expert knowledge or at least experience in particular fields by virtue of the fact that they've been around long enough typically, whereas elected politicians, they tend to term out when there are term limits, or they move on to various other fields, or they might not just have expertise in the particular area that is the subject of a given piece of legislation. So the lobbyists sometimes do play the role of providing information to the politicians. The problem is the information is often one-sided. It serves the interests of the clients of those lobbyists. And very often the way in which the information is one-sided is not obvious. The lobbyist is less likely to tell an overt lie and more likely to just selectively present actual facts and omit inconvenient facts. So the US Transhumanist Party supports a greater degree of participation from intelligent laypersons who don't have that kind of incentive. And if they're objective subject matter experts, then that's all the better. Another aspect that I think needs to be considered is the disproportionate representation of attorneys in politics. I think about 40% of elected office holders are attorneys, whereas less than 1% of the population are attorneys. So how do you think that kind of imbalance between the amount and variety of knowledge and expertise within the general public and the kinds of people from the kinds of fields that tend to get involved in politics be rectified so that we don't have this imbalance of information facing politicians?
I should have brought this up earlier because it was relevant earlier as well, but it's particularly relevant to what you just asked now. I think one of the major issues we're facing is gerrymandering and the fact that representative districts, especially in Congress, are so pushed to be heavily blue or heavily red in some cases that the representatives that they elect are not representative of the public at large and are instead mirroring the fringe beliefs of far left or far right individuals that were cherry picked to make up a district. And I think that's one of the reasons we see such little bipartisanship right now. I would love to see a lot more bipartisanship and people working together and across the aisle and far less party line votes. I think that would significantly increase the quality of our governments and of our representatives. But with the gerrymandering system we have in place, which I think is a byproduct of this two-party system in which it's a pure team sport, tribal fight for power and all of these different regards, it's the end result of that system. And I think that system is what we need to overcome. And when we are only electing representatives with a specific background, I think many of it is, for example, coming from lawyers previously it's, a requirement basically had to be that you were religious to be elected in the United States. Whether, I mean, that's not written anywhere, but of course it was true in terms of the voting box. I think that when we have such uniformity in our governments, we are missing that diversity of voices and opinions. And I'm not only talking about gender differences or racial differences, although I think that is important to consider as well. I'm talking about ideological differences and experiential differences. I think that's really where we get ideas mixing and blending and coming together to form something new. And so many politicians run on platforms in which they say, for example, I'm unwavering on this issue, I will never change on it. And if a politician does change their mind, they are immediately attacked for flip-flopping. And I think that's one of the worst symptoms we have in our current government, because flip-flopping to me, although there are reasons to do it that are not that great, perhaps you're bought off or you are convinced for a favor, but realistically, I think a lot of that is changing your mind when you get new information. And I can honestly say that there's not a single thing that I believe that I think that I would know for sure that I'll believe in 50 years. I'm open for any of my beliefs being changed. There's nothing that I am unwavering on. And I wish that more politicians had at least somewhat of that belief.
Yes.
It's interesting because partisan rigidity was one of the aspects that the founders warned against when they drafted the Constitution. The Constitution explicitly does not have any provisions for political parties because the founders hoped that none would form. Of course, political parties did form even during the administration of the first president, George Washington, but Washington hated political factionalism and warned against it in his farewell address. And then Thomas Jefferson warned against political parties, even though he himself was part of the Democratic Republican Party. And it does seem like this extra constitutional apparatus, the two-party system, emerged in the United States and usurped the machinery of government, including writing laws that disfavor the entry and participation of minor political parties through gerrymandered districts, which you mentioned. And by the way, the US Transhumanist Party supports the use of artificial intelligence to objectively rewrite the boundaries of these districts so that there's no partisan favoritism involved. But there are also other measures that both the Democrats and the Republicans use in the United States, the restrictive ballot access laws, for example, as well as control of the Commission on Presidential Debates, very close ties to mainstream media outlets, encouraging them to de-emphasize coverage of minor political parties, and many other requirements that essentially institutionally tilt the playing field against any newcomers, even though the Constitution doesn't enable that at all. So this arose outside of the parameters of the Constitution, but unfortunately has become especially entrenched over the past 30 years. And over the past 5 years, it has led to such an explosion of toxic, hateful behavior on both sides of the political spectrum. Ahmed Bouzid does point out in some of his comments that he notes that there's been a lot of divisiveness on even basic public health matters like the COVID-19 vaccine. It does seem to me, by the way, that partisan stances on vaccination shifted, flip-flopped perhaps, because in late 2020, the Democrats actually were almost anti-vaxxers, in my view, because they didn't want the vaccines rolled out prior to the November election. They were fearful that this could legitimize the Trump administration and give Trump the extra edge that he needed to win. But now, of course, it seems the predominant volume of skepticism toward COVID-19 vaccines is coming from certain elements of the Republican Party. So these stances, they're not even ideologically consistent. They're just used as ammunition against the other side in this tribal contest that you're describing. And Ahmed Bouzid uses the example that if Joe Biden and his administration, for whatever reason, supported transhumanism and spoke out in its favor, he's 100% certain that Fox News would unleash a relentless attack. And probably the opposite scenario could be envisioned as well, where if prominent Republican politicians spoke out in favor of transhumanism, they would be attacked by some segments of the left aligned with the Democratic Party. So how do we prevent this almost gratuitous politicization of issues, the all-encompassing presence of politics in matters that even a few decades ago would have been considered apolitical?
Well, I think you're exactly right in something you said that there is very little ideological consistency in the positions of these parties. I think the filibuster is a great example of that. Whether or not you are in favor of the filibuster depends on what role your party has in the Senate. I think that's amazing how that is true over time, that this seems to be the case. And you also brought up the news media there. Now, I think the news media is incredibly important. The work that many journalists do to uncover and publicize the truth or the facts of the matter in many cases is a service that is greatly needed in any society. And I think a lot of that is missing. I think any major media outlet that you point to or the journalists within it have a clear bias, and it's oftentimes very apparent in their writing in terms of what they decide to focus on or what facts they decide to omit in certain cases or what narrative is being pushed. And there is a great desire to have members of the news media be objective and unbiased. And I think that that is just purely impossible. So we should stop striving for that goal. Instead, let's strive to have members of the news media openly declare their biases to the best of their ability. Say, this is my perspective on the issue. Now, here's my take on this, or here's as objective as I feel I can be on this issue. And then leave it up to the audience to determine. But having this revolving door between political parties and the news media and sharing information, or it's just not working out. And it's a mirage and a facade that I think we need to drop already and just recognize it for what it is. I think just that would greatly help out the political discourse in this country and stop much of the partisanship. Because I think a lot of that is driven by the media and the narratives that are being pushed. And I hate saying that because, again, I think the media is greatly important. So I hope that we can overcome some of those things. But I think it's also going to take an intelligent and caring voting population or citizen population to be able to not vilify the other side and hopefully recognize their own inconsistencies in their ideology and really question why they believe what they do. Because I really think that in general, most humans have the same goals. I think they want to work towards prosperity for all, equal opportunity, equal representation in front of the law. I think all of these are shared values between Republicans and Democrats and everyone else for the most part. And I think we need to stop looking at the other, whatever label that they might have, as the enemy of us, and really look at how we could work towards them. And just so I heed my own advice here, I want to be completely transparent about my own beliefs. I am a registered Democrat. I am not a member of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, although the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform most accurately represents my views out of any of the parties. Second highest would probably be the Libertarian Party. I am not a member of the Libertarian Party, mainly because I want to have a voice in the primaries here in Pennsylvania, where I am a resident. And I On the left-right political spectrum, I am highly in the middle, perhaps slightly to the left. I am of the left. I'm certainly not a conservative. And on the authoritarian libertarian political spectrum, I am far libertarian. So that's personally where I sit on the political spectrum, what my beliefs and background are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this is quite interesting because in my view, it seems hyper-pluralism among political parties and within the political discourse is the antidote toward these problems that we pointed out. And David Wood has an interesting comment in the chat. He says, I don't think that political parties by themselves are a problem. The problem is the rigidity of the party system, lack of ability for people to move parties and for new parties to be formed. And I agree with him. The problem is not per se that the Republican and Democratic parties exist. The problem is how difficult it is to compete with them, even for parties that have been in existence for a long time, like the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. They still have to fight for ballot access every election cycle. And ideally, in a hyper-pluralist environment, people wouldn't have to make this kind of pragmatic calculus of thinking, well, I really hate the primary spokespeople, the representatives of a given party, or the people who might have captured it. Like a lot of Republicans still detest Donald Trump, for example, but feel that they have to play along with a Republican Party whose main mechanisms of governance and fundraising and attention dissemination have been seized by Donald Trump and his supporters. So if people didn't have to concern themselves with that, we might see the major parties split. And instead of the Republican and Democratic parties, we might see 3 or 4 parties emerging from those former blocs. And there would be other parties that were never affiliated with either one or the other as well. I wouldn't be surprised in such a situation if, in addition to a transhumanist party, there were, for instance, a workers' rights party, an LGBTQ party, an environmentalist party, a religious fundamentalist party, a pro-business party. So this kind of hyper-pluralism lends itself to more attempts at finding mutually acceptable solutions, as in parliamentary democracies, where multiple parties have to form coalition governments most of the time. And so they can't just railroad their agendas through. They have to find other allies and appeal to shared goals. Do you think anytime, say within the next 10 years, the climate of American politics could improve to such an extent that people don't see half of the population as their enemy? At the very least, they're willing to have these civil conversations. They're willing to see each person as an individual, maybe try to locate that person along a more sophisticated political grid. You mentioned the libertarian, authoritarian, and then the economic right versus left axes. But there could be many more dimensions as well, along which one could situate a particular individual. Do you think it's realistic within the next 10 years that Americans will start thinking like that, instead of thinking of someone they encounter, oh, this person must be left-wing or this person must be right-wing, and that shuts off any nuanced consideration?
I would certainly hope so. I hope that we can move in that direction. I know that I am actively trying to make that happen. I think that one thing that might help make that happen is something you already mentioned in your conversation there, which is the emergence of a new political party. I would love to see the non-Donald Trump right and the classical liberal leaning left form a more centrist political party in America. I would be so happy to see that happen. And I think they could be a leading force in American politics today if people were to actually get behind a movement like that. And I think that, if the conditions are right, could be the solution to a lot of the problems we're addressing there. Because I do see this polarization and hyper-partisanship as a major issue in America today. I think it is splitting us up culturally to the point that sports leagues, entertainment, restaurants are being broken up on a left-right degree where the people on the political left only shop and listen to and learn from or go to certain places, and the political right does the opposite. And at that point, we're living in two completely different cultures and societies. And I noticed that a lot leading up to the 2020 election, where Pennsylvania is a very purple state, and I live in a purple area in a purple state. And I would talk to people in my circle who are Donald Trump supporters, who are voting Republican, and they would be convinced that Donald Trump was going to win in a landslide because everyone that they talk to is voting for Donald Trump. And the opposite on my left-leaning friends, they were convinced that Biden was going to win because there's no way that anyone could possibly vote for Donald Trump. And these people live in the same areas. They just don't talk to each other. They don't interact with each other. They're not in the same circles. And I think we need to break down the cyber balkanization we have that divides us into these camps of people within our bubble. And a lot of that is algorithmically determined based on our social media and what is suggested to us. A lot of it is based on social pressure from work and the clubs and activities that we're in, based on the industries that we're a part of. We need to actively try to break that down. Seek out friends from political ideologies that are different from yours. Have real conversations with them. Don't mute or delete or block people that have different opinions from you that you encounter on your social media. Make a effort to keep those opinions in your life, especially if you disagree with them, because you need to see the things you disagree with. I think that is extremely important. Now, the one other thing that I'll bring up, you mentioned what could bring us together again. Now, this is very unfortunate, and I hope this doesn't happen, but one thing could be a common enemy. If we are bombed by a foreign nation tomorrow, I think you could see a lot of that interpolitical animosity in the United States fall away with a common enemy, or perhaps aliens invade tomorrow and then humanity is united against the aliens. That could have some good aspects because it brings people together, but also I don't want to fight the aliens. So that's one way to look at it as well.
And I think you make some excellent points there. Now, on the subject of the common enemy, when the COVID-19 pandemic began, I was of the mindset that the novel coronavirus was exactly that kind of common enemy. And Brent also points out in our internal chat, COVID-19 didn't work as that common enemy. Indeed, what we saw was even greater divisiveness in our society as every issue surrounding the pandemic, the handling of the pandemic, the origins of the virus, any sorts of economic adjustments or measures, they all became sources of partisan division. So I'm curious, why do you think COVID-19 didn't work as that kind of unifying common enemy, even though theoretically speaking, it's a much better enemy to have than other people, other sentient entities? I would rather have the enemy be barely animate, as a virus is, because then there are no moral qualms about fighting that enemy. It's clearly destructive. It clearly should be eradicated.
Yeah, I think the issue with COVID-19, why it didn't serve that role, is because of the plausible deniability around it. At least, especially at the beginning, it was this thing from China that no one had really experienced. You don't know anyone that has it. I'm talking about in January and February of 2020. And yet there are these things being proposed. By the time we got through March, you're talking about lockdowns, and near the end of March, beginning of April, we're talking about masking and social distancing and the closure of businesses. And I think at that point, this was still a distant enemy that a lot of people didn't have a grasp of. And so a lot of people saw it as a political power grab, as something that those in power are building up as a threat that isn't really a threat, as an excuse to come after our civil liberties and our civil rights and to clamp down with authoritarian measures. And I think that's not what we saw necessarily after September 11th, because September 11th was very visible. This is the enemy. It's on our doorstep. These are the results of it. We can all see it regardless of our political party. And not only that, but we have someone somewhere supposedly taking credit for doing it and claiming that they did do it and why they did it. And we didn't have that with COVID-19. In fact, we had a lot of people believing that it wasn't real to begin with, that it was a hoax in some cases. So I think that's why the virus didn't work in that role in the same way that a physical threat might.
Yes, and that is a shame because threats like COVID-19 are actually more damaging than most man-made threats. If you consider the deaths from wars in American history, the death toll of COVID-19, officially it's a bit under 600,000, but probably in reality it's greater than that. And if it's even, say, 700,000, that's greater than the number of casualties in the Civil War, which was the most destructive war in US history. So this pandemic, as you mentioned, this is a fairly mild virus as far as pandemic-causing viruses go, still killed more people than the most destructive military conflicts in US history. And yet, because it's not the same kind of overtly visible threat, I think people discount it. I would like the common enemy to be death, because that is an enemy that we all face. And at various points in our lives, we do come close to it if we witness a friend or a family member die, or if we have a situation where we ourselves come close to death. We do have this palpable reality in front of us, and yet in many other situations, people try to push it out of their minds for evolutionarily understandable reasons, as Aubrey de Grey points out. But I do wish that people could realize, now that we're on the cusp of developing the technologies that could overcome this problem, we should be investing many more resources into doing so than most humans are willing to. But Daniel Twett does point out in the YouTube chat that he thinks the Overton window in politics and society is on the side of transhumanism. Do you agree with him on this? Do you think we can get to a point within the next few decades when people do see death, disease, decay, ruin as these kinds of common enemies, and they stop seeing other human beings as enemies?
I think that's a great question. And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I want to touch upon something you just said there about that you wish that death could be the common enemy. I think another reason that COVID-19 wasn't seen as that common enemy is that, sure, it did end the life of some middle-aged and younger people who were healthy, but by and large, it was a disease that took on the elderly that have pre-existing comorbidities who in many cases were already beyond their expected lifespan, statistically speaking. And I don't say that to diminish any of these deaths. I think all of them are tragic, and I would love to avoid every single one of them. But I think a reason that there was perhaps some of that plausible deniability is, you'll remember towards the beginning of this pandemic that a lot of the deaths that were being reported, people were claiming were actually asthma or cancer or the flu or some other sickness that was also thrown into COVID-19, whether there was a positive test or not, just to up these numbers for whatever authoritarian reason was being suggested at that moment in time. And I think it's similar to death, which is we don't recognize it as this a major enemy because it's mainly impacting people who we already expect to be close to death or already die. There are the people that get cancer young or die tragically in a car accident. And those, I think, in many cases are the most impactful for many of us because it was unexpected. We have these ideas that they had so much more to give and so much more to live for. But we don't really have a societal notion of people in their 90s necessarily going on to do big things in the future or having milestone events in their life beyond that. So when their life ends at 90, we don't necessarily see it as much of a loss as we do for a younger person. And I would love to overcome that. I think these you live to a certain age and then you die mindset needs to be overcome completely so that we can envision people contributing to society, growing and learning and having great life moments beyond the ages that we expect them to die today. Now, getting to the Overton window question, I think that there are two Overton windows in today's society. I think there's one on the left and there's one on the right. The things that are said in circles on the right would never be okay to say in circles on the left, and the opposite holds true as well. We have two Overton windows where in different societies where certain things are acceptable in one situation and not in another. And I would love to see that Overton window reemerge in the center to make it so that we agree upon what is something that we can work towards or what we can say or what we can do. And I'm worried that instead it's splitting further apart. But overall, I mean, I'm a transhumanist and I believe that we are moving towards a transhumanist future. Despite what's happened in 2020 and what's happened so far in 2021, I think humanity is on a positive direction. I still have an optimistic outlook on the future. So I would agree with that question that, yeah, I think the Overton window, to the extent that it exists, supports what we are working towards. And I think really, barring some cataclysmic event, progress of humanity working towards transhumanist goals is inevitable.
Yes, and thank you for that astute assessment. It is also my view that actually a more centrist general environment, broadly speaking, is more conducive to the progress of transhumanist ideas. Any sort of polarizing ideology, as well as any sort of rigid and idiosyncratic ideology that says to the general public, essentially, you have to adhere to every point of this or else you are the enemy, those would tend to subvert and undermine progress, because progress requires innovation, experimentation, creativity, the willingness to reconsider past positions that you mentioned. So any rigid or dogmatic or extreme ideology is not conducive to that. And we've even seen that in ideologies that explicitly champion rationality and evidence in the scientific method. I think of objectivism, for example. And I have a great deal of sympathy with objectivism and the thinking of Ayn Rand, but I do recognize that she became very rigid later on in her life. And both she and some of her followers insisted on complete agreement, complete adherence to their ideas. And that led the objectivist movement to stagnate and to become irrelevant to the broader cultural conversation. Whereas had they been more open, had they been more flexible, had they been more willing to hear out people of other perspectives, including people who disagreed with them, I think they would have been a much more potent cultural influence and could have brought a lot of good into the broader society. So that is an example, I think, of why it's important to have a pluralistic, centrist, inclusive general culture in which these advances can take root. Now, with regard to how we move forward from that, Zach Richardson has an interesting comment. He states, the longevity revolution is going to be moved forward by private industry. Government by nature can only respond to the amazing leaps forward that companies like BioViva, which is Liz Parrish's company, make. So what do you think of that assessment? He seems to think that there will be innovation in the private sector. It will outpace the ability of government to respond, and governments will inevitably be reactive. They'll try to frame policy years after the fact of the technology's emergence, but really the private innovators are the ones who are setting the terms for what the future will look like. Or do you see some issues with the ability of the private entrepreneurs to even get to the point where they release a viable technology because of the regulatory obstacles in the way or the cultural obstacles in the way?
I agree that at this moment in time, it is private companies that are pushing the longevity movement forward. I think a lot of that is because of the fact that Because aging is not considered a disease from a medical standpoint, you're limited in the amount of funding that can be allotted to research affecting that. So academics choose a specialty to focus on, or researchers choose something like cancer or Alzheimer's or other diseases of aging, which are very important for us to tackle. But there's no general funding for research on aging. And I think if we were to get aging is classified as a disease, we could open up channels for governmental funding to these things, which might increase the government's role in pushing the science and technology forward. I would like to see that happen, but in general, I don't see a problem with the private industries leading this path forward. I think that's completely fine. I would love to see them succeed. I think we've seen a lot of funding recently in the biomedical longevity space. I'm very excited about Vitalik Buterin's recent donations to the Methuselah Foundation, his past donations to the SENS Research Foundation, and others that are pushing this work forward. I think he's going to do a great deal to popularize this and get it something that's talked about in the eyes of the public. I would love to see that to continue. So yeah, I'm fine with the private industries pushing it forward, although I would like to see government at least have the ability to fund this research by classifying aging as a disease.
Mhm. Yes, I absolutely agree with the classification of aging as a disease. And Brent Ellman in our internal chat points out that the National Institute of Aging also exists and does valuable research. And I generally have libertarian leaning proclivities as you do, but I do see a role of government, one, to set up an environment where this kind of research can take root and progress with minimal obstacles, set up a receptive regulatory framework that doesn't hold back these advances for years and decades, but also in terms of performing research that may not be immediately commercializable. If a government agency undertakes that, or if a government agency invests in medical supplies or vaccines, the ability to distribute those to many people rapidly, especially in a time like this, especially in a pandemic, I think a strong case for that could be made. And also, I say that because we are battling against the clock here. And with a purely free market, one could make the case that eventually, once all of the information is made available, once all efforts at persuasion are successful and people get their priorities right, then the correct amount of research will happen and will advance the field to the extent desirable. But the question is, will we be around in time for that outcome? So my inclination is to say, let's devote all available resources at our disposal right now, try to make breakthroughs everywhere in persuading anyone, be that a private investor or a government agency, to support that kind of research and to create a conducive environment for it. Now, with regard to Vitalik Buterin, who is, of course, the founder of Ethereum and one of the best known cryptocurrency entrepreneurs right now, he happens to be a strong supporter of life extension, and he had sympathies even when he was starting out. He made a donation, I think, of around $2, the equivalent thereof in cryptocurrency, to the SENS Research Foundation several years ago. Do you think that this group of emerging cryptocurrency millionaires, and in some cases billionaires, are distinctly sympathetic to longevity in a way that they might be the wealthy funders that our movement has sought for a long time? And people were lamenting, well, why isn't Peter Thiel or Larry Page or Sergey Brin investing more money, though they have been doing their own projects in this realm? Do you think the cryptocurrency millionaires are actually going to be the people who help the explicitly pro-longevity, pro-rejuvenation biotechnology organizations that publicly advocate for getting these advancements developed and distributed to the general public.
Yeah, to touch on what you just said there, sure, there are organizations within the government, since this is taking a step back from the crypto question for a second, there are organizations within the government, various governments, that are focused on aging as a concern. There's the All Party Parliamentarian Group in the UK. There's UN initiatives focused on aging. There's a Senate group in the United States focused on it. What I find is that a lot of these groups have aging in the name, and you would expect that they'd be worried about longevity. But really, what they tend to talk about in their meetings and their work is retirement plans and pension systems and things that are tangentially related to improving the lives of seniors, but aren't necessarily the work that we would think of as important from a longevity science perspective. And I would love to see some more of that happen. So we need to be careful not to let these names fool us, but also the fact that these organizations already exist might give us an avenue to readjust their mission to where I personally feel they could be most useful and most of service to the populations they serve. Getting to the crypto question, I do think there is strong overlap between the cryptocurrency early adopters and the ones that have made fortunes from that technology, and people who have futurist longevity science leanings. There's huge overlap in there. Many of the people that I've learned about cryptocurrency from initially were people that are in the futurist and transhumanist movements. And I am excited to see them push that forward. And frankly, I'm excited to see that a lot of these people ended up making a lot of money in cryptocurrency. I think they're some of the people that I trust to do well with that money and use it in a way that can push humanity forward. A lot of them got into, developing decentralized, public, transparent systems for the future and blockchain technology because they are forward thinking and care about humanity in the long term. And I think those goals serve their interest in longevity quite well. And I would love to see that happen going forward. What I'm also excited about is the Methuselah Foundation, if I remember correctly, did not immediately decide to transfer all of that crypto to currency and spend it right away. They are trying to use some of these cryptocurrencies as essentially longevity currencies and rebrand them to be the currency of life extension. And I think that that's important both from a branding and marketing perspective, but also really just to increase the market cap of money that is being spent on longevity work. I think that's important as well.
Yes, indeed. And I think this is a space that we need to watch closely in the coming months, especially because there is a lot of enthusiasm for cryptocurrencies right now. We may be in a situation of a temporary market spike, but certainly cryptocurrencies in general are here to stay. And it's interesting to consider which ones will be the cryptocurrencies of the future. My personal opinion is it's not going to be Bitcoin. It's going to be some selection of what are today considered altcoins. And I would be highly interested in longevity branded altcoins that could be used to support this research going forward. Now, Brent Elman had a comment about the dog aging project and the support granted to it by the National Institute of Aging. Brent, would you care to speak about that?
Yeah, sure thing. The National Institute of Aging has granted grants to the dog aging project. Most recently, a $23 million grant. They're working out of Colorado State University. Luckily enough, my dog was accepted into this program, and I am working on getting him into a rapamycin trial. So the National Institute of Aging does work on these types of matters. It seems to me, at least, to be the FDA is really the issue here, though, because it would be much more difficult to try to run these types of trials with human test subjects. So I don't think that the National Institute of Aging is just about retirement and things like that necessarily, but I think that it's there are still some major issues preventing these types of research from being done. But I don't think that it's I don't think that there is a lack of interest. I think that there's just lots of things to overcome before that can really happen on a large scale.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And I wish your dog all the best as one of the participants in this dog aging project. You know, dogs are tragically short-lived. It's rare for a dog to live beyond the age of 13. Even cats live longer. Cats can live into their 20s. For a dog, that's essentially unheard of. So I really hope that this project is able to shed some light on techniques that could extend canine lifespan. And of course, that's a market that I think is going to find a lot of interest among humans, even humans who might be skeptical about their own longevity. They would not have the same reservations about making a dog live to age 20, for instance. Ryan, would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. And I am very excited about the dog aging project, mainly because we see a lot of promising studies on nematodes or mice occasionally. But as we step up to dogs, I think these are more, advanced mammals in some cases for a lot of these technologies to be tested on. As was mentioned, it's difficult in many ways to get human trials off the ground on some of these early technologies before they've been proven in other animal models. And I think dogs are an important step to get to that point. And I'm a dog owner myself. I have a golden retriever. I love him to death. I would love to see his lifespan be extended. Unfortunately, golden retrievers in particular have a relatively short lifespan, 8 to 10 years in many cases, and almost all of them die of cancer. So these are, the aging related diseases that impact dogs and humans alike, that hopefully beyond extending canine lifespan, we can find things that work for humans as well.
Yes, indeed. I completely agree with you on that. And it's such a tragedy. Golden retrievers are such nice, friendly dogs as well. Certainly, they deserve to live longer than 8 to 10 years. Now, with regard to life extension, of course, you are a significant contributor to what is now called the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation, and their website is lifespan.io. So could you tell us a bit more about your involvement with Leaf and lifespan.io over the years?
Sure. So I have long been interested, obviously, in extending healthy human lifespan. And Leaf was an organization that I've had my eye on for years because I love the work that they were doing, both in actively crowdfunding sources of money to fund projects related to the science of aging, and also creating important media and news content highlighting the work being done in this field, dispelling myths against longevity science, and overcoming a lot of the opinions that people might bring up counter life extension. So I've supported their work for a long time. And I had as a guest on my Future Grind podcast, Dr. Oliver Medvedik, who, in addition to working with GenSpace at that time, was also working with the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation. And I had an interview with him about life extension science on my podcast, which turned out to be one of the more popular episodes of my podcast. And I immediately went back to them after that and said, I love this work. It's clearly resonating with my audience. I would love to promote what you're doing more. So that essentially led to me partnering with them to host the monthly Rejuvenation Roundup podcast, which is a co-production between Future Grind and Lifespan.io, which is essentially a recap of each month's new science and developments in anti-aging and life extension technology. They're short episodes, 15 to 20 minutes usually, in which I recap some of the scientific publications from that month, perhaps highlight an interview or an episode that we put out on a lifespan extension related topic. And that eventually led to me working more formally with this organization to edit their videos and in some cases host their videos. So I edit the weekly Lifespan News YouTube series that is hosted by Brent Nally and put out weekly on the Life Extend Show YouTube page. And I also work with Science to Save the World, which is our kind of offshoot programming focused more on building a positive future using science, as it says in the name, to save the world. So we talk about science and technology that could be used to improve the human condition going forward. So this is the work that I'm doing now with the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation. And there's a lot more in the works that I don't want to get into too many details of now, but be on the lookout for some exciting new content coming from us soon. I think that the work that this organization in general is doing to popularize life extension science, make it something that's not weird and taboo, and that is accessible, that people can encounter on their news feeds and not think anything of it. I think it's great, and it's exactly what we need more of.
I think everybody here wants to hear all about them updates. So if you want to let us know, you know where we are.
So I can give you general ideas. A lot of it is going to be more content that is being put out more often. So we're certainly keeping an eye on the trends in terms of digital media and the landscape. Of course, I think as we're demonstrating right now, live streaming is a big part of that. Interviews with subject matter experts, one-on-one discussions is a big part of that. I'd expect to see a lot more of that with people that are both researchers and anti-aging science in the academic space, perhaps our business leaders or investors working in this space, or perhaps authors and pop culture actors and members of the celebrity class that are interested in this as well. Expect to be hearing a lot more from those types of people, ideally with the goal, again, of disseminating this information and getting it out there beyond the circles that it would naturally flow to. I think everyone watching this live stream, whether live or recorded later, self-selected to see that content because likely they're already interested in it. Ideally, some of you got here because the YouTube algorithm just threw this your way, and this is your first exposure to this type of content. If so, please stick around. But again, we just want to reach more of those people for the first time. And I think that's the goal going forward.
Yes, absolutely. And I have been impressed at how effective the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation has been over the years in attracting additional notice and additional support to longevity science and the promotion of longevity science to the general public. Of course, the crowdfunding campaigns are quite nice because they give people tangible ways to contribute to emerging research. And they also give people the understanding that there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit in the field. You don't have to be a millionaire. You don't have to be a scientist in order to make a contribution. Indeed, if you give $10 to a fundraiser, that will help. There is a fundraiser currently ongoing called Pearl, Participatory Evaluation of Aging with Rapamycin for Longevity. And that has been, I think, in my experience, the fundraiser that reached its goal the fastest in the history of lifespan.io. I've linked to it in the YouTube chat as well, but they're continuing to gather funds for an even more expansive study, the first systematic study of the effects of rapamycin on human biomarkers of longevity. So that's quite intriguing. Now, what do you think are some of the ingredients of successful advocacy for longevity that LEAF has been able to deploy? And especially, I phrase this in terms of how do we scale successful longevity advocacy, because we know of a few people who do it quite effectively now, but to make it a widespread, broadly recognized phenomenon, we need a lot more people doing it effectively. So what is LEAF doing right in this regard?
So I think one of the major things here is speaking in a language that people will not be kind of scared of or turned off about. I think many people, myself included, that work with or at the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation might identify as transhumanists. That's not a word that I personally use in my content. I don't brand my content as transhumanist content. It's just updates on longevity science, and it's broadly accessible to anyone. I don't try to add any labels on it that people might be concerned about or turned off by. I know that the US Transhumanist Party is very effective in using that word to kind of have people gather around. But just because it's a different goal of what we're doing, we try to shy away from that word a little bit more. And I think that that does have value because then they're focused on learning about the content that we are putting out rather than at the same time determining what is transhumanism, what do they believe, what is, we're not speaking as representatives of a group, we're just letting people know what is happening. And a lot of it is making that content, first of all, have a high production value so it looks good, it's something that people want to come back to, it's not just cobbled together, and that it's bite-sized and accessible for social media. We do a lot of stuff in the square aspect ratio for Facebook or Instagram. We do the YouTube shorts, which is also common on TikTok. You'll see these vertical short videos that are have a lot of text and are very engaging and quick. And I think kind of building upon what is popular in media today and making sure that we cater our content to the different platforms to make sure that we are putting out what people want to see there, catching on with what is popular in society at the time, I think is a great way to go about that. We want to make sure that this is content that the longevity enthusiasts aren't the only ones watching, that people feel comfortable sharing with their friends who might have no idea what this is, that they won't feel weird about putting on their social media timelines and their walls, that seems like just regular pop culture science content that is interesting and relevant to them. And I think we're succeeding in that, and I'd love to see this grow.
Yes, and this is quite a useful set of observations for those seeking to promote longevity. Of course, the greatest bottleneck that I have found in regard to successful promotion is, in many cases, simply a lack of manpower combined with a lack of time. So we, I think, have a really diverse and well-developed set of skills within the transhumanist movement. So all of the activities that you described are activities that people within our movement would be capable of. Sometimes it does seem like there are just not enough people and not enough time in the day for the people who are engaged in these activities. So what has Leaf done to enable itself to have not just a steady stream of content, but a growing stream of content and an active, consistent presence in a variety of venues where not only is content posted, but it's customized to each venue?
Yeah. So I think one thing that the life extension movement has on its side is almost everyone involved in it is deeply passionate and they're self-motivated to do something. You're not trying to convince people of the importance of writing this article or doing this video or attending this talk. They know the importance of it if they're already convinced of that. I think the importance is getting other people in the general public to be convinced of that as well. And also, a certain amount of funding does make that possible. The Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation has something we call Lifespan Heroes, which is essentially monthly subscribers that donate to keep up the organization running. That enables us to create this content, to put it out there, to spend more time and manpower focusing on that. So certainly money goes a long way in this. And a question that I think I get most often that I see other people get a lot as well is, I'm interested in life extension science. I am not a biologist. I am not a researcher. I'm not a multimillionaire. How can I make an impact in this? What can I do? And content creation is a huge part of that. But even more important is sharing the content that is created. Just making sure you signal boost and amplify and broadcast the great messaging that is being put out there is perhaps the most important thing you can do to, perhaps you're not a millionaire, perhaps you're not a scientist, but if you can reach a millionaire or a scientist within your network or in the extensions of your network, that could be all the difference in this going forward. So I think that's what I would suggest that many people get involved with doing. And I think that's the work that really needs to be done here.
Yes, and I think these are great observations. And I was thinking about this earlier today prior to our conversation. What can a lot of people do even on a basic level? And I know a lot of video creators always say this to their audiences, but it really does help if you subscribe, if you like the video, if you share the video, if you keep coming back for other content, like the videos released by the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation, or like these virtual enlightenment salons, or many other pieces of content online about longevity. You can educate yourself to an immense extent about the emerging scientific advancements, as well as the opportunities to support projects like Pearl. And I would say our greatest obstacle is this awareness gap that is still quite large, but every person can help overcome it by sticking around within the movement and spreading these ideas and these projects to others. Now, I want to get back to the discussion of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we had quite an interesting analysis from Zach Richardson in the YouTube chat. He thinks that COVID actually did bring people together in a certain way. He states that the Democrats and Republicans may still hiss at each other, but we made massive supply chain strides in getting the population vaccinated. Now, over 50% of the US population has been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. He also says there was a massive amount of collaboration among logistics companies offering free or discounted services. Thousands donated freely toward research efforts. Giant biotech companies doing research, tons of food donated, tons of medicines created. And he says, yes, hindsight is 2020, but that does not discount the fact that we made a miracle. Do you agree with his assessment? And following up on that, what do you think will be the long-term implications of the COVID-19 pandemic? Has it slowed down the pace of progress, or has it rather accelerated the kind of technological progress that we transhumanists, life extension advocates want to see?
Well, yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think the last major pandemic similar to the one we saw in 2020 was probably the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So really not, I mean, pretty much everyone from that time has passed away by now. There was like entire generations in between, which didn't have a cultural memory of having to go through this type of thing. My hope is that cultural memory now sticks around. I don't think that the next COVID-19 level pandemic is going to be a century away. I think it's quite likely that there's one that's going to happen much sooner than that. So I would hope that we now know how to act when that situation arises in terms of mask up, social distance. Here's the things that we need to do, the protocols that need to instantly be put in place to avoid the spread of what we saw with COVID-19. And also making sure that there are, as was mentioned, supply chains that can be, things can be manufactured locally, vaccines and PPE can be made in various states, in various countries, so that an economic breakdown or supply chain breakdown doesn't close off people from that necessary equipment. Hopefully we are stockpiling PPE both on a national level and also in our homes. I would hope we all have enough PPE and masks available now that we can get the good KN95 ones. I know at the beginning they were saying don't buy those, just use cloth masks. I think now that this is largely subsided, stock up on KN95s, at least enough to keep you and your household safe if this were to happen again. Make sure that we are self-sufficient as much as possible. And I am most fearful that those lessons will not be learned, that we will instantly go back to living life as we did, not make any changes, and be in the same boat again when the next pandemic arises, as it surely will. My other main hope at the onset of this pandemic was that we would finally get rid of the precautionary principle, and that we would see the shortcomings in that and the flaws with that, and how much it delayed the progress of getting much needed treatment to those who were willing to take it. I was hoping this would be the downfall of that. It doesn't look like it's going to be. It looks like the precautionary principle is going to be with us for quite a while longer, which I think is terrible. I would love to see some proaction happening here. And I think if anything changes in the near term, it would be overcoming the precautionary principle. And I think that's something I want to commit myself to working towards. So I'll end that there, but I could have other things to say as well. But I think that's the most sufficient answer to your question.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that was an excellent answer. Of course, we in the U.S. Transhumanist Party have advocated overcoming the precautionary principle for a long time, and we devoted several prior virtual enlightenment salons to that conversation. We had earlier this year virtual enlightenment salons with Max Moore and Mary Ruart, as well as our special panel on FDA reform, where we discussed a variety of pathways toward a more proactionary regulatory environment where we don't hold up needlessly the life-saving vaccines and other medical treatments that indeed I think could have prevented this pandemic altogether had they been deployed in time. And I share your hope that people will not just return to the prior status quo, because that prior status quo is what caught us completely unaware at the time that the pandemic struck and made us sitting ducks, essentially, for this kind of devastating virus. But hopefully next time humans will take some of the lessons that have been learned and be more proactive in protecting themselves, as well as supporting medical innovations that can protect the broader population. So I think this is a good bridge into the biohacking community, because actually there were some biohackers who tried to develop their own COVID-19 vaccines. I believe, based on my understanding, they were successful in actually protecting themselves. And I think Josiah Zahner may have been one of them, who even live streamed himself developing these experimental vaccines. Of course, YouTube took down the live stream, unfortunately, but he seems to be fine right now, and his colleagues seem to be fine as well. So you've been involved in the biohacking community, and I would be curious to find out more about the nature of your involvement and what you think some of the most promising directions of research and experimentation within that community are.
Sure. So just a little bit of background on that topic. I was first introduced to the world of biohacking in around 2014, I want to say. I was actually working on Capitol Hill in a congressional office, and I was browsing the internet one day, and I came across a news story of people that were essentially implanting their own homemade devices, implants, into their bodies to prove that that is feasible, to prove it could be done. And that team that was doing that work was Grindhouse Wetware. And I noticed that they were based in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I became fascinated with this. I loved the work that they were doing. I saw that they could use some help in terms of marketing and public facing outreach and messaging, which is what my background was in. So why I couldn't develop the technology hands-on, they were quite sufficient at doing that. I could help them on the business and public facing side of things. So I quickly left DC, returned home to Pittsburgh, and got involved working with them. And the device that I first became familiar with this was this device here. This is the Circadia device. It was implanted in Grindhouse Wetware co-founder Tim Cannon's left forearm in a procedure in 2014 in Germany. And essentially, it takes your body's temperature and sends it wirelessly over Bluetooth to an Android device. So you could imagine how this could be used to monitor you if you are getting sick, to let you know if there is an emergency arising, or in an extreme situation, if your body temperature spikes or drops to unsafe levels, to contact emergency services and let them know that there's a problem. Now, this device was admittedly huge and very unadvanced. It only does temperature. And the reason for that was we wanted to make it as simple as possible. We wanted to show that this could be done essentially in a basement in Pittsburgh, manufactured and implanted. Now, I don't recommend that many people go that route. I think that safety is paramount. I think that should be the prioritization of everything. We work with professional body modification artists to do this, who are very experienced putting things under people's skin. And we, did all the biosafety testing that was possible to make sure this was safe. But there is this whole community of people that want to push science and technology forward. And they see that there are regulatory barriers or gatekeeper institutions that are not making that possible, and that they're not going to get funding for these projects from investors, and that there's not a pathway to market for a lot of these things because of the regulatory issues involved. So they do it themselves. There's whole communities of people that are working on this technology, and I truly feel that they are building the future and popularizing this content and this work in a way that traditional academic scientists are not and cannot. And I want to see that continuing. And I think this gets into a lot of bodily autonomy issues when we talk about the fact that, right, I believe that people should be able to do whatever they want to their own body. And biohacking is a huge part of that. And you get into concerns of, well, can you implant something in another consenting adult, or is that assault? Can you help them develop the own materials that they want to implant in their own body? Or at that point, are you committing a crime just doing that? These are questions that people are actively facing, which is why I think the societal conversation around biohacking and the work that is being done needs to be at the forefront. And they're difficult conversations, but I think they need to be had now. And really, I'm excited to see where this technology is going. And ultimately, I do think this technology, this implantable technology, is going to become popularized. And when it does, I don't think you'll consider it biohacking anymore. It'll be just like the products that Apple or Google or anyone else put out, and it won't seem weird at all.
It's interesting because there are already implantable hearing aids and functional prosthetics and artificial organs in certain cases. Some people have artificial hearts, at least temporarily. And the term biohacking generally isn't associated with that. It's more associated with this do-it-yourself culture of experimentation in areas that haven't yet gone through official review processes or been deployed in medical institutions. But it is a growing movement. And of course, you and I were involved in perhaps the first legislative activism for biohackers' rights in the United States in Nevada during the 2019 legislative session, when we helped amend Assembly Bill 226 to remove a prohibition on voluntary microchip implants. And of course, compared to that Circadia device that you showed, what Democratic Assemblyman Skip Daly tried to prohibit were these tiny grain-sized NFC and RFID implants, because he read about Three Square Market, the company in Wisconsin that asked its employees voluntarily to implant these devices that the company itself manufactured just as a proof of concept. But he became so afraid of this He thought that employers everywhere were going to use these to track their workers, or health insurance companies were going to use them in order to receive health metrics from people. And those of us who went to the legislature for our first cyborg and transhumanist forum had some of these technologies on display and had the task of communicating to people that these technologies aren't even capable of that kind of remote monitoring that people were afraid of. So it seems that was an educational challenge, but it was a challenge that was successfully overcome within that particular context. What do you think about the broader public? Are there still misconceptions about some of the projects pursued by biohackers, and perhaps dystopian fears among the general public of these experimental technologies that aren't really justified given what these technologies can and cannot do?
Yeah, talking about the Nevada legislative session there, I want to give a shout out to Anastasia Sin, the magician and pioneer of biohacking and implantable technology, who spoke quite powerfully, I think, to the legislators considering that bill about why exactly it's important to allow people to continue doing this and to kind of satisfy some of their concerns and alleviate some of their fears. I think that video of that, which I think you had up on your YouTube at some point, I imagine it's still there, is something that everyone should watch and something that should be duplicated around the country when more legislation similar to this pops up, as I know that it will. So I think a lot of the criticisms that I've encountered of biohacking technology is from people who think that it's leading us towards technology that will one day be mandated. And I think part of that was in Skip Daly's opposition to this as well, fear that people won't have a choice. And I think anyone in the biohacking and transhumanist communities that I know of, at least, would be very quick to say, absolutely not. This should always be up to the choice of the individual. None of this should be forced in any way on anyone. People should be fully consenting to the procedure being done and completely know what the device is capable of. Many biohackers and transhumanists would go beyond that and say not only that, they should have complete ownership of that device and the data that comes from it. They should be the ones that control that, not any corporation or business or government. I think if those things are in place, that's exactly the right way for this to go about. So, and on that note, I think a lot of people are skeptical about implantable technology because they know of what happens to companies like Google and Apple, and there's these data leaks and hacks and privacy violations. And are they, what, how are they using algorithms to target us? And what is our data being used for without our consent? And I think the biohackers have a good solution to that problem in the sense that if Grindhouse Wetware, for example, was making something, we do have values in this community that perhaps the Apples and the Googles of the world do not. We are able to explain the technology to you directly in a way that is transparent and open and considerate of your rights, that really it provides an alternative to some of these mega corporations. Now, I want to be clear that if Apple or Google came out with some of this technology today, I would be completely for it. I would probably get it. I would advocate that other people get it. I think that these are great companies doing great work, but I think there does need to be an alternative to them. And I think biohackers offer that alternative. So I think a lot of the fears about this are misplaced. You mentioned quite earlier in this conversation that there are people that think you're essentially an Illuminati reptilian out to dominate the world. We have people saying that about biohackers as well. Like you said, I assure you that is not the case. I have never received a call from the Illuminati or from any reptile. If they are out there, I would love to speak with them. But essentially, that's where we stand now, is we're just trying to push this technology forward. And people have, I think, some valid criticisms of it that says, first of all, that's dangerous. What you're doing has risks. Second of all, it's not even very effective. So that device can take your temperature. We have thermometers. What are you really innovating? And I think those are valid criticisms. And to them, what I would say is when the Wright brothers flew that first plane at Kitty Hawk, they risked their lives. They could have easily died. They went a few hundred feet, a few dozen feet in the air, and it lasted seconds. In 60 years from that moment, we were landing on the surface of the moon. So right now, biohackers are at Kitty Hawk. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's risky. No, it's not all that impressive. But where are we going to be in 60 years? And I think the biohackers are doing a lot of great work in building that path forward. We realize it's iterative design. We realize that what's happening now is not all that impressive, but we're proving concepts and we're building upon them and we're increasing the knowledge of this to the public. And I think that's where the value lies.
So along these lines, Jason Geringer asks, what kinds of biohacking upgrades and achievements are you looking forward to?
So I think that I should be clear that I have no augmentations right now whatsoever. Beyond that, I have no tattoos and no piercings. I am completely biological, natural human. Many people in the biohacking community do have tattoos and they do have piercings and they augment their appearance in other ways with dyed hair or aesthetic implants that are not functional in any way. And here's an example of that here, which is the North Star device, which I can put this light on, see if I can do it. It'll work. So this basically turns on red with this magnet that I have, and many people have these magnets implanted in their fingers. So this is a device, for example, that is purely aesthetic. It lights up under your skin. We can say that it mimics bioluminescence and shows off what humans might be like if we evolved slightly differently, if we evolved the same traits that some insects and fish have. But realistically, at the end of the day, it's a light under the skin. It's cool for some people not interested whatsoever. Personally, for me, I'm not interested in a light under the skin. I want to have functional implants. I want to have things that adjust my sensory perception of the world, that change how I interact, what I can learn, what I can know. And many people are doing that with finger magnet implants, as I already mentioned. They are good for neat little bar tricks, which you can pick up paper clips or bottle caps or things like that. But beyond that, you can sense electromagnetic fields in some way with them. You can tell when a hard drive is working or when a wire is live, or especially things like microwaves, you can sense quite readily. And understanding this and how it works, we can build devices to piggyback on these sensory inputs, to send Morse code information, for example, to someone through their finger magnet. And we have done this quite well. There's a video that Vice put out when they came to visit us, in which we essentially rigged a poker game by me sending the playing card information of the other players to Tim Cannon's finger through a Morse code device that was hidden in his pocket. So these are the types of things this can do. And that's what I'm interested in. Magnets have shortcomings at this point in the sense that they break down over time, especially if the protective coating on them wears away, and they can really get covered in scar tissue to the point that they are no longer effective. There's a lot of work to make them more resilient and long lasting. Once they get to that point, I will likely absolutely get a finger magnet. I'm more interested in also brain enhancements. I'm very interested in the work that Neuralink is doing. And that's one of those things that right now the biohacking community is largely working with subdermal implants that are just under the first layers of skin. They're not yet interacting with organs in any significant way. They're not interacting with the nervous system, and they're certainly not interacting with the brain. I think people would like to get to that point, but there's a layer of complexity there that regulation keeps us from interacting with, that just procurement of goods and resources and the cost associated with that keeps us from working with. So really what I need to see happen here is a change in the way that we view augmentative technology. There's a lot of questions now of, is this even medicine, or should it be viewed as something different? I could get on that tangent right now, but I don't want to lead us too far astray. So I'll end that there and see what follow-ups you might have.
Yes, indeed. And there can be a variety of fascinating follow-ups. First, a brief one from Brent Ellman. Where do people typically implant the North Star device?
It typically goes directly on top of the hand like this. I have seen people put it in their forearms as well. I've seen people put it in their center of their chest, like an arc reactor you might see in Iron Man. There's been a lot of talk of, I don't know science fiction quite at all. And I'm an outlier in these communities for this reason, but there's that movie with the light in the center of the hand. People have talked about that. I haven't seen anyone actually do that yet, but it's been proposed.
Interesting. Now, I am like you in that I don't have any aesthetic body modifications. I
Yeah,
tend to think that
me
if
either.
if I want to change the appearance of my skin, I could just put on a different article of clothing. And clothing is very versatile. You can change it multiple times a day, and it can display whatever aesthetic you want it to display. Whereas, for instance, tattoos are quite permanent. At least one has to go through quite a procedure, a painful procedure to get one removed. So I prefer not to do that. I think a lot of people may wonder about the subdermal implants. Isn't there a nearly equivalent way of getting a similar capability? For instance, if one attached the North Star via some sort of cloth strap that goes around the hand, and then the device sits on the back of the hand as part of that strap, or any sort of RFID chip. Could one have like a ring with the chip embedded in it and have a similar effect? Would you say the subdermal implantation is intended not even primarily to get those devices implanted, but rather to gain experience in the act of implanting devices that could be a lot more functional and really would need to integrate with the internal workings of the body in the future?
That's absolutely correct. We realize that a lot of the biohacking work that's being done now is not necessarily breaking any barriers. There have been powered implants inside the body for decades now at this point in medical contexts. There have been subdermal aesthetic implants in the body for decades at this point when you're talking about silicone shapes and such that go inside the body from a body modification perspective. So what we are doing is combining these things together to show that it's possible, to show that these things can be done, not just in highly funded academic, governmental, or corporate labs, but by hobbyists literally in their basement can do these types of things. And I think that shows that it is possible. There's no excuse why major companies might not be doing this. And I think, of course, Apple or Google could do what we are doing to an extent that we could never do with the amount of talent and funding and resources that they have. Think one of the reasons that they're not is there's already public outcry about how invasive their technology might be and how it violates privacy. Imagine the public outcry if they were to come out with an implantable device similar to these things. And I think by biohackers doing this first, we are getting society comfortable with this, aware of this technology, so that perhaps we're paving the path for corporate players to actually and safely come forward, knowing that they could bring this to market in a way that people are already familiar with. I think that's a great service that this type of work could provide. And you mentioned it absolutely there. One of the major reasons I don't have these implants is because they're not adding any function that I cannot get from an external wearable. I think RFID tags and NFC tags are great, but there's so many different protocols out there. If I wanted one for my phone and one for my home lock and one for my car and one for work and my office, I would need 8 different implants. And I don't want that. I would like to have one single one that does many things. There's not a consistent protocol yet, so I don't currently have that. I am looking forward to getting an implant that provides something that I cannot get from a wearable device. And when it comes to medical information, I think that's where you're going to get that. I think the Apple Watch, for example, does great at detecting your heart rate and heart rate variability, and perhaps your stress sensors based on your sweat and your skin electrical conductivity. And there's other sensors like that that you can get external to the body with wearable devices. There are other things that I think would be much easier inside the body with direct access to blood or other fluids to analyze instantly. And I think that getting under the skin is the best way to do some of those things. And I think that's where you're going to see those benefits. And I'll mention a little side thing here, which is there was a lot of demand for people to purchase Grindhouse Wetware's products. We have never made them publicly available beyond beta testing with people that we know and trust, and walk them through the process of getting the procedure and sharing feedback to us based on that. But we had many people wanting to buy these devices. One of the reasons we didn't bring them to market is because there were a lot of questions about the liability around that. First of all, who is allowed to implant these devices? Who is allowed to consent to them being implanted? If something does go wrong and it's because of the product, who's responsible? If something goes wrong and it's because of user error, who is responsible? None of these things are answered yet. We did not feel safe bringing a product to market in that environment. But there was a spin-off company of Grindhouse Wetware created. And this company, Livestock Labs, intended to bring basically Grindhouse Wetware technology to market for the target market of cattle and monitoring the health and wellness of cattle. And there was a lot of funding given from the Australian government, for example, to this type of work. There was outside investments in this work. And the plan was, and as far as I know, is to bring this technology to market for cattle. And ideally, from that, bring it back to humans. Because unfortunately, there's not a direct path to humans. And I think Livestock Labs is one of the first companies that can say that we know it's relatively safe for cattle because it was tested on humans first. So there's something that we can look forward to is bringing this technology back to the human market once we have the pathway in place to do that. That pathway doesn't currently exist. That's where the work needs to be done.
Yes, this is quite interesting and innovative to take implants that were tested in humans, deploy them in cattle, and have a more widespread case for ultimate implementation in humans. So thank you for sharing that. Now, Zach Richardson wonders, given how much of advanced technology is sensitive to magnetic destruction, would having a magnet implant handicap a person's ability to use a lot of devices?
I haven't heard of any major issues. The things that are most common would be accidentally turning off your laptop screen because there are magnetic sensors that know when the screen is closed. Other things have been perhaps accidentally erasing a hotel card to your room so your key does not work because of the magnet in your finger. There have been times that people have perhaps had to get an MRI or some other kind of medical test in which it wasn't necessarily the case that the magnet would have presented a danger to the person or the machine, but that for safety's sake, the medical professionals insisted that the device come out before a test is performed. That's something that I have heard of happening. The other thing would be that people with perhaps pacemakers or heart implants might want to avoid the presence of a magnet in their body because of they're advised to keep those types of devices away from magnetic fields in general. So those are the instances that I have heard of. But I've heard of people alternatively that perhaps were an electrician working with a wire that they thought was not live and were reached out to touch it, were able to feel in their finger that there was power going through that, and perhaps save their life because they didn't touch that wire because of the magnet in their body. And in these ways, you are actually providing an additional sense. This is a human capable of sensing electromagnetic fields with no
awesome.
external tools, with only their body. And as you mentioned earlier, of course, you could perhaps wear a magnet glued to your finger and have a similar sensation. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that it is inside your body. It becomes psychologically a part of you. People consider that sense something that is theirs, not external to them. They perhaps dream then in this sense. They start thinking about it in a way that they would think about their hearing and their taste, which is you're smelling something right now, of course, unless it's particularly pungent, you're not noticing that whatsoever. It's the same with these type of vibrations in the finger magnet. You might get used to the baseline electricity in your environment, only noticing it when it's something new and different, or calling your attention to something that perhaps your attention should be drawn towards, just as our other senses work. And I think that's quite valuable.
Yes, indeed. This is definitely quite an interesting capability for humans to have, and the potential life-saving implications in certain situations are definitely worthwhile to consider as well. Jason Geringer wonders, how much money do you think it would cost to build a biohacking lab in your basement or garage? What awareness do you have of the extent of financial expenditures needed for a person to get into biohacking and to do it competently?
I don't think there's an easy one answer to this question. I think that general hardware engineering devices that you would need would be crucial, first of all. I think that you would need to have some type of cleanliness in that environment. So you need the proper air filters, the proper precautions in place. A lot of the work that we do at Grindhouse Wetware, for example, even though things might be designed in a basement, we do not necessarily manufacture them there. We send them to third parties for the bioproof coatings and to make sure that they are correctly made and safe. And then they're sent back to us. So they're not fully made in a basement. There is an amount of funding that is needed for the creation of the devices beyond that. Is it theoretically possible to make a device completely in your basement? Sure. I think that would significantly increase the costs and would also significantly decrease the safety. I would advise that people make use of the reputable product and service providers in these industries that are already existing wherever possible. Now, as soon as you use the word medical grade with any of these things, the price increases exponentially. So be aware of that. But in many cases, what is considered medical grade and what is not is quite similar. If people want to cut corners, that's a place to do it. Again, I would not recommend that, but if you want to keep costs as low as possible, that is one way. I'd also recommend, I keep using the word DIY. Yes, people design these implants themselves, manufacture them in many cases themselves to the extent possible, but you should go to a professional body modification artist when you get them implanted. I would not recommend doing that alone at home. Some people do small things such as the RFIDs, which can often be done with an injector, or the finger magnets, which are a little bit more complex, but are not invasive surgery. For example, in many cases, they're just subdermal magnets. For much beyond that, absolutely, I would go to a professional body modification artist for your own safety. The reason I'm saying body modification artist and not medical professional is mainly because even if medical professionals and doctors have an interest in doing this type of work, which many of them do, they're not allowed to. They would face liability there. It goes against, first of all, the Hippocratic Oath, which would be first, do no harm. Without a medical justification for these types of things, they can't justify putting these devices in your body. So there are rules in place that keep the medical industry from participating, even if their participation would make this safer. And that's why I bring up the fact that I think we do need to have a conversation around, is augmentation medical or is it not? Because the regulations that we put on this and the requirements that we put on the manufacturers of these products really hinge on that distinction.
Yes, indeed. And it is tragic that a whole profession of individuals who actually have great expertise to contribute is, in effect, shut out of this biohacking ecosystem by restrictions, even though hypothetically one could conceive in the future a kind of hybrid doctor and body modification artist who would be specialized in implanting these biohacking augmentations in safe and minimally invasive ways.
If I can speak on that a little bit, I think this middle ground that you could be talking about might be cosmetic surgeons or plastic surgeons, a number of which have reached out to me with an interest in exactly that type of thing. So in these cases, these are people that are trained medical doctors. They've went to medical school. They perform procedures using medical devices and medical equipment in sterile medical environments. And they do that not necessarily to treat any disease or condition. It could be that someone just wants to adjust their aesthetic appearance. Now, you could justify that perhaps a breast reduction surgery has some health benefit because of the support of the back or whatever else, or things like that. You can make a lot of justifications from a medical standpoint for a lot of these procedures, but many of them truly, at the end of the day, are just for the augmentation of the aesthetic appearance. You could make an argument that this type of body modification work with biohacking and implants could fall directly into that same place, which is that you would design these implants. They would be FDA approved medical devices that would ultimately be implanted by the equivalent of a cosmetic or plastic surgeon. The issue with that is going through the FDA process, getting them to be medical devices, and then implanted only by medical professionals would significantly increase the costs. If you were talking about fears of a delineation between the haves and the have-nots, which is exacerbated by advanced science and technology, this is a scenario that you might be talking about, in which those with money can augment themselves to be even better and more able to protect and create more wealth for themselves. And those at the bottom end of the spectrum will be put even further behind because they lack access not only to wealth anymore, but now to the tools to augment themselves. That's one potential future. The other one is this is not considered a medical technology. It is not heavily regulated, and people can essentially market these products as perhaps a body modification artist would market jewelry or a piercing. They're done with minimal oversight. There's not a lot of regulation involved. And that would mean that this technology is democratized. Almost anyone can have access to it and do whatever they want. Although this increases the danger. People will undoubtedly be injured or killed from this technology going wrong or being implanted in unsafe environments by untrained people. There's two paths to take there. I don't think either one of them will be taken completely. We're undoubtedly going to choose a middle ground, but we need to weigh the benefits and the risks associated with both of them because they are extreme in both cases.
Yes, and of course the proactionary principle is all about weighing the benefits and the risks of every alternative, not just the posited action that is being taken, but also of inaction or alternative courses of action. So this would be a very interesting field whose future I think all of our viewers should monitor. I'm also curious with regard to what you think the impact of biohackers will be in addressing the next pandemic, given that right now we've had some experimentation with makeshift COVID-19 vaccines by people like Josiah Zayner. But what about impacts on a broader scale, where if everyone, or at least many people in the general population, do gain some basic biohacking acumen via this democratization that you described, do you think that could be among the array of public health measures that will render our societies more resilient against the next pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's quite likely going to be the case. Speaking directly about Josiah Zayner and his work with his team, my understanding is that they did self-inject an experimental COVID-19 vaccine. The results of that were that antibodies were present in a subsequent antibody test. Whether that was the result of the vaccine or they had some asymptomatic case of it, you can't say for sure. It was a very, very small sample size. But yes, antibodies were present from what I understand, and they are still safe to this day. So nothing went drastically wrong as of now. And I also want to point out that if I'm speaking correctly, which I think I am, they did not develop their plan for a vaccine from scratch. They took something from the medical literature that was already being discussed and talked about as a potential vaccine, and they essentially made it at home and tested it. So they're not reinventing the wheel in this case. They are taking knowledge and information from the medical experts and duplicating it at home, which I think increases the level of safety involved, although things could certainly go wrong. But they weren't doing this themselves from scratch. And I think that's one of the roles they could play, is not necessarily creating things brand new, but increasing the amount of testing and how quick testing can be done. And you talk about another role that biohackers could play could be showing that they are interested in volunteering for these types of things. I think they'd be active participants in human challenge trials, were those to be something that would come up in a future pandemic scenario, which I would absolutely advocate that we do look into human challenge trials. I understand the bioethical questions that go alongside that. I still think it's worthwhile and we should allow that to happen and encourage that to happen. So these are the roles that biohackers could play. And it wasn't only biohackers were very active in the COVID-19 pandemic, not only in, for example, creating that vaccine, but also repurposing their labs and their equipment to create respirators in many cases, to shift their focus and their knowledge of equipment and medical devices and materials to create PPE and tools for hospitals as it was needed. Biohackers did a lot of this work. It wasn't necessarily on the biological components, but it was on the overall response to the pandemic that they were, I think, essential in helping out with.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the kind of initiative that I think everybody should appreciate instead of just passively isolating oneself and living life in fear of what is admittedly a potentially deadly virus. These people took concrete actions to actually help resolve this pandemic. So they are definitely to be applauded for that. Now, I would like to open this up to the panel to see if anyone has any additional questions on transhumanist advocacy, longevity advocacy, biohacking, the political situation before we proceed to discussing consciousness and free will. So Art Ramon, what questions do you have?
Yeah, both transhumanism and UFOs are in the realm of science fiction. And if it's ever revealed that UFOs are real in some sort of UFO disclosure, and they no longer are just restricted to the realm of science fiction, and even if they don't say what exactly they are, but that they are real, do you think that would affect the transhumanist movement? You know, would it give it more validity?
If there was a super advanced extraterrestrial species that we had evidence of existing, I think it would give a lot of credibility to the transhumanist movement, that our ideas of overcoming our biological limitations and expanding our reach out into the solar system and beyond are actually possible and demonstrably so. So I think we would see that, of course, we can do these things. Others already have. That would, I think, be the first step. And I think it would really increase our aspirations as a species that, we want to do that as well. So I think that would increase a lot of funding and attention toward that type of work and really put us in perspective in the universal landscape. I think that humans often see ourselves as the top of the food chain, the top animal here on Earth. We have no one to compete with but ourselves. If there was some kind of, I don't mean an animosity, but a friendly competition, hopefully, with an extraterrestrial species to advance ourselves to be on that level, I think that could be healthy and helpful.
Yes, indeed, I agree. And I think in that future, the Transhumanist Party is the one best suited for preparing humankind in terms of how to respond, because we have the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which specifically identifies as sentient entities any intelligent extraterrestrial life forms that may be discovered. So we would have a framework for peacefully interacting with them, respecting their rights, setting the stage for that kind of friendly competition that you describe. Now, Jason, what questions do you have?
Well, I asked most of them, but again, like you and Gennady there, yeah, I don't have no tattoos, no piercings or nothing like that. You know what I mean? But like everyone else here, I strongly support morphological freedom. For me personally, that means that I'm free to not change myself, if I don't want to. So I figured, by supporting other people's right to change, it also supports my right to not change if I want. So I think that, I like to emphasize that because the religious people get kind of terrified about the mark of the beast, and so our policy also will protect them from that, so they should stop worrying about it.
I think you bring up a great point there, and especially as it relates to a major criticism that I hear of transhumanism is that there's a fear that everyone would become the same. They would modify themselves to get rid of diversity in humanity and all converge on a single view of what humans should be. I think if you go to any biohacking conference or event, you will immediately see that that is not the case. There is a plethora of abilities that people want, of aesthetic appearances that people have today. There's a broad gender spectrum and ideological spectrum, so many different hair colors and people augmenting themselves in different ways already, that any fear of humanity converging on a single path should be put to bed immediately by looking at the biohackers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably pretty obvious. And the other Ben Franklin thing, your question was way better than mine. I probably would have asked him how he got all them old chicks over there in France. He was smoothie. But that's it. Go ahead, Brent.
All right, let's go to Brent now.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. It was a great presentation. Lots of great information. My question is regarding biohacking. As someone, and I noticed in the comments, some other people, I think Zach Richardson mentioned interest in getting some of these types of additions to his body. If I wanted to do something like this, what would be the route that what would you recommend, the route that I'd go down to try to investigate?
So one of the leading companies in this right now that actually has products commercially available would be a company called Dangerous Things, run by Amal Grafstra. He has a spin-off company of that called VivoKey. His main product at this point is NFC and RFID tags for identity verification. He has broad goals of making this something that can be used for payment platforms and basically a universal key that stays on your body to replace much of the more problematic biometric identity authentication things that might be like your iris or your fingerprints. There's a lot of problems with that, which RFID or NFC could replace. He is doing great work with that type of things. He's also, I mentioned the problems with the magnets that exist, that there's no really great biocoding for them, and they tend to break or degrade over time. He is doing some work to make magnets that could be more useful. The ones he has now are encased in glass, I believe, which increases their size to the extent that they might not be great for the fingertip, which is where magnets are typically placed, but they could be placed elsewhere in the body. So his magnets are worth looking into as well. I think that's the best place to get commercially available things right now. Beyond that, if you want any of the other devices, you're going to need to talk to the people who are making them themselves. If you have an idea of a specific thing that you want, there are online forums. Biohack.me is the website. We also have a fairly active Slack channel. So if you want to talk to people that are making these devices, pitch your own projects, get feedback on them, participate in the ideation or the creation of these things and the feedback. If you have subject matter expertise in anything in general, please come to these channels, share your advice, be a part of this conversation going forward. We would love to have you.
All right.
One
Excellent.
more quick question.
Yes.
This might be kind of a weird question, but has anybody started looking into like drugs, like an implant that they just carry their drugs around, and all they got to do is swipe a magnet over it, and that's doses them up for the day? You know, is that an idea? Has anyone?
Yeah, that absolutely is something that has been looked into. Primarily, the context that I hear it being discussed for are on the battlefield. So that if someone is injured in war, for example, they might have medicine available instantly that their implant can just release to them. The other major application, which I think I'm more interested in, is spaceflight for an astronaut to perhaps have implanted medicine already in their body so that they can be treated for something they might encounter in the future. I think there are major risks associated with that. One of them, of course, is hacking. I think at DEF CON, there was a few years ago, there was a case of being able to hack an implant so that it triggers a lethal dose of insulin being released into the body in a way that makes it look like a technical error, so that you essentially could assassinate someone with one of these implants and have it never be identified as anything more than a problem with the device. When you're talking about medicine being stored inside the body, that's a major concern. You're going to need to have this safety and security in place, but absolutely could be useful. And really, what I am looking forward to is a day in which your health is constantly being monitored to a level at which the implant just takes care of the problems, and then maybe at the end of the day lets you know what happened, that you were getting sick, you had this virus in your body, or you had this precancerous cell. The implant took care of them. The antibodies, the nanomachines took care of them. You don't need to worry about it anymore. That is perhaps the distant future that I would love to see, where these implants just take care of medical conditions as they arise.
Indeed,
Yeah,
that would be.
there's all the natural drugs from our body, like adrenaline and all that stuff too, that could maybe. Go ahead, Kennedy. Sorry.
Yeah, that would be a wonderful future. What sorts of privacy protections do you think would need to exist on a technical level in order to prevent the kind of hacking that you described? Is it possible to make these devices invulnerable to external attacks, perhaps have them operate on a different network, or not be connected to a network connected to something more local that's under control of the individual?
Or a Faraday cage.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a possibility. I think that, first of all, when these technologies are being developed, they need to be developed with security in mind. Security and safety can't be bolted on later once you have a finished product. That never turns out well. I think you need to have a mind for this from the beginning. Your idea of keeping them off network or on their own network or not connected to the internet might be good. The downfall with that is this information would be valuable to society in general. Imagine with the COVID-19 pandemic having instant notifications that 10 people in San Francisco had their devices detect this COVID-19 variant. That could be anonymous data, but if you have it localized to a geographic region, you could plan responses to these types of things based on that information. So that would be valuable to have. Perhaps an intermediary device, which is connected locally to the device in the body and then shares that information separately outwardly, might offer a layer of protection, for example. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it should be up to the individual. Some might be okay with the risk of it being connected to a network for perhaps the added benefits that come with that, perhaps more personalization or customization of their environment to their needs. For example, imagine if your device was connected to your Internet of Things technologies in your home, so that your lighting or your heating could adjust based on your physiological needs, whether you're tired or waking up or going to sleep, or if you're stressed. Your environment could react to you if you allow it to connect to these networks. If you don't, you might not get those benefits, but you might be safer from hacks. So it's going to be up to the individual. what they want to prioritize in those situations.
Mhm. Now, I wonder, and I think this is in part a bridge to the next subject of our conversation. If you have an implanted device that connects to external devices and is able to elicit some sort of reaction from those external devices, where does one draw the boundary between the self and the outside world? Because if one has an unconnected implant, just as if one has a prosthetic, I would still consider that an extension of the self. I don't think many people would say their artificial heart or their implanted hearing aid is a foreign object. It's still part of their body. It does useful work of the body. But then if it communicates to some other device, some other system, does that also become part of the self if it's configured in some way that's customized to the preferences of the individual? Or do we give it a different classification, something between the self and the purely external environment?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of technologies that straddle this boundary. I think things like you mentioned, like hearing aids, for example, or even glasses, for example. Like, are you wearing your glasses? They're augmenting your vision. Yeah, perhaps you are wearing them and they're an external tool. Now let's talk about contact lenses. The terminology around contact lenses is you put them in. You wear them, but you put them in. They're under your eyelid. They're there. Are these worn or are they part of your body? And extending that out to wheelchairs or crutches, for example, or prosthetic limbs, even. Are you wearing a prosthetic limb or is that prosthetic limb your arm? And when we talk about wheelchairs, we could take it a level further. Let's grant that wheelchairs are a part of the person's body for the purpose of mobility. They need that to get around. That is them. Now, can you add an engine to that? Can you add a steering wheel? At what point does that wheelchair become a car? And then is that car a part of your body when you're operating it? There's so many different lines and variabilities that you can look at when you're having these conversations. And I don't have an easy answer to it. I think it's a worthwhile thing to think about and to explore from a philosophical perspective. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure what it impacts from a policy or human standpoint. I'm not sure what the end result of finding that answer might be, other than what can we apply like assault laws to, right? If you break someone's prosthetic limb, do you break their arm? What if you break their wheelchair? What if you break their implant? I think these things might be where you apply that in the realm of law or in any functional sense. But beyond that, I'm not really sure, but it is very interesting to think about.
Mhm. Yes, I think in the realm of law, in the realm of defining personhood, defining where the boundary of the self is that could potentially be infringed, that would definitely be an important set of questions. Of course, we do have laws against damaging somebody's property, and for centuries, political theorists, classical liberal theorists, have made the point that property is an extension of the self in a legal sense, in that one can implement one's will upon the external world by means of property, by means of using the property in a certain way, and even entering into contracts, agreements, getting other people to use one's own property in a way that one sets forth in advance. Of course, rules about property damage are different from rules about damage to a person's body because it's easier to replace property. And so the punishment for stealing or destroying somebody's property, generally speaking, is going to be milder than the punishment for inflicting bodily harm that often can't be fully repaired. And this is also an area where these kinds of devices offer an interesting set of possibilities, because if you damage somebody's prosthetic, that prosthetic likely could be replaced more easily than a biological limb today. But I'll add the caveat, or could it? What if regenerative capabilities advance at the same time and you could regrow a limb that has been lost, and people will have options. Well, do they want to regrow their biological limb? Do they want a prosthetic limb that might offer certain different functionalities? We might have a greater proliferation of diversity there. I'll also point out that one of the original guests at my physical enlightenment salons back when they were held in person was John Murrieta, and you can still find videos of the conversations we had with John Murrieta. He is a quadriplegic who has an advanced wheelchair. This wheelchair, it's not just your standard chair with wheels. It has all sorts of functions that enable him to move in a more versatile way. He has his van configured to his wheelchair so that he can drive despite being mostly paralyzed. And also, he was able to move around my house with a fair amount of ease. I had to put up a wooden ramp over the stairs in the entryway so that he could ride up that ramp on his wheelchair. But it's a motorized wheelchair. He can move on his own. Nobody has to push him. And he definitely considers that wheelchair an extension of himself. He wouldn't be able to do a small fraction of the activities he engages in were it not for that device. So I think we're going to see a lot more situations where people will consider that technology to be so integral to their sense of identity, to their capabilities, that they will start to identify with it.
Perhaps to take that to the next level and maybe relate it to, I think, where you're going from this point, might be looking beyond physical objects and looking at the virtual environment as well. Is an avatar you? Can an avatar be assaulted or violated or raped? And if so, is that a crime or a harm committed against you, the person? I think that's an interesting arena to look at as well when we're talking about the self and the extension of the body.
I believe there have already been situations like this where, for instance, in Second Life, people have alleged that they were being cyberbullied by other people and their avatars were being attacked by other people's avatars. Of course, it's interesting to think about because there are certain virtual worlds, certain multiplayer games where that's kind of the point. If you play a multiplayer war game, your avatar is a soldier and the other people's avatars are soldiers and you fight the other people. And so there's a certain expectation that some people's avatars might incur damage. So that is an interesting area because how one defines damage in that digital realm really has to do with the expectations that one went into that realm with.
I think so. And it also depends on how immersive and realistic that environment is. There are people today that wear vests, for example, that have haptic sensors or motors in them that you can feel when someone touches you or hits you in a virtual environment. Now, of course, those are calibrated to not actually harm you in any way, but you can imagine a future in which they technologically could, where getting punched in a virtual world could be the equivalent of getting punched in real life on your physical body. And what happens at that point, or these war environments where even if you are safe in this fictional battle scenario, people do receive PTSD from war experiences. And if your virtual environment is immersive to the point that your brain believes that it is in this traumatic, dangerous environment, could you get PTSD or some other disorder or disease or ramification from your participation in these environments? That's going to be a real thing I think we have to encounter.
Sure, I wouldn't see why not. I mean, you could get freaked out by nightmares, right? So, I mean, I would think you could.
Yes, and it's interesting too because a lot of the games that people have played up to now were, in some ways, even with very good computer graphics, distinctly different from the experience of everyday life. I think a person today could still look at excellent CGI and say, well, this is not quite lifelike. There's still a certain degree of differentiation, especially if you're looking at it on a flat screen. But if one does enter a fully immersive virtual reality world that simulates a lot of the senses, some of those distinctions might fall away. We had a great virtual enlightenment salon in February with Sever Vlad Sfrengeuk, who is an expert on virtual reality, and he showcased some of the devices that are now available to consumers. And he made the point that in the course of the past 2 years, a lot of this technology has finally been within the reach of the general public, whereas previously a lot of it was either experimental or very cumbersome, to say the least. But we had a great conversation about the implications of the availability of this technology and what sorts of rules and approaches to moderation in those virtual worlds we would need to prevent cyberbullying, for instance, or other perceived infringements of what people would consider a good experience, or even respect of their fundamental human rights. So that was a great conversation that I would recommend our viewers look into. Now, I also wanted to get your thoughts on the subjects of consciousness and free will, because you mentioned in the Break the Rules live stream that you may be a bit skeptical about whether free will exists. And I'm actually one of the individuals who considers free will to be fundamental to the human experience, in that I know I have free will because I directly perceive myself engaged in the act of choice. And I know that I could choose differently. For instance, I have this pen in front of me. I could choose to move it to the right, my right. I could choose to move it to the left. And now I chose to move it to the left again. I could just as easily have chosen to move it to the right. There is nothing inherent about my past. There's nothing inherent about my biology that necessarily predestined me to move it to the left that third time. So I'm curious with regard to where you stand on free will and whether it exists. If it does exist, how does it manifest itself in humans?
Yeah, so I wish that free will existed. I would love to think of myself as a being that has my own choice and direction and ability to impact my future. Unfortunately, I just don't see where the roots of that free will could be. I understand that I am a biological creature with genes that I did not determine, that I did not grant myself, with past experiences that I did not grant myself, living in an environment that, in general, least at the beginning, I did not choose in any way as a product of my past circumstances. Like, for example, if you I don't want to use a Hitler example, so let me think of another one. If Well, we don't even need to make it a real person. If you were born, we're just going to go with Hitler because it's easy. If you were born as Hitler, would you have chosen a different life? Could you have chosen a different life? I personally don't think you could have. I think that whatever determinations based on opinions or preference were from a genetic, biological level were there from the beginning. I think that the experiences that he had throughout his life forced him into those things without any choice of his own. I don't know where the presence for choice would come from. For example, with the pen, I imagine there were other things on your desk that you could have picked up. You went with the pen. I'm sure you could rationalize, well, the pen was the closest, it was the smallest, it wouldn't have made much noise, it would have been easy to demonstrate on front of the camera, and you could retroactively rationalize your decision as though it was your own, but I'm not sure that it was. And the fact that the pen was there for you to pick up, why was that pen there? Did someone else put it there? Did you buy it in the store because you liked the color black as opposed to the color blue? What made you like the color black? Was it something that happened in your past with a negative experience with the color blue that you chose the black pen instead? Essentially, I don't know where the root of choice could come from, because I think every decision in your life that you think you're making yourself stems back to something that happened before it that gave you the preconditions to make that choice. And when you get to the root cause of it, you had no say in any of it. You didn't bring any of it about, and you have no role in how it played out, is how I view it. And I'd love to hear your reaction to that.
Well, I definitely think there are preconditions to every choice, certain circumstances that make it even possible for one to be in a situation to choose one way or the other. But at every moment of our existence, we, in a multitude of ways, face the opportunity to make a choice that is based on those prior conditions, but not fully determined by them. So that pen could have come to my desk in a variety of ways that didn't predetermine what I was going to do with it. So whether it was a black pen or a blue pen or anything else, whether I had gotten it or somebody else had gotten it, it wouldn't have affected the substance of my demonstration. So had it been a blue pen, I would have picked it up. Here's a blue pen from the SENS Research Foundation, and I could have made the same demonstration with it. So here I'm moving it to the right, here I'm moving it to the left, here I'm moving it to the left again. And I would be able to envision many circumstances where, irrespective of the path by which a person came to a situation, a similar situation could have arisen and similar choices would have been made available, and that person wouldn't have been restricted from making those choices simply based on the origin of that context. Now, I would also say, from a biological standpoint, it seems to me free will is an emergent property, much like life itself, except at a higher order of complexity. So the fundamental building blocks of our bodies, atoms, even subatomic particles, they're not conscious. At least I don't subscribe to the hypothesis that everything in the universe is a little bit conscious, but it's the arrangement of these atoms, a very sophisticated arrangement with multiple tissues and organs and the interactions of those organs that supports life, and that in creatures of a certain complexity supports consciousness. And volition seems to be just an even higher order emergent property. Once you have a certain level of complexity, a certain arrangement of molecules within the brain, it emerges and it gives certain sentient entities the ability to make these unconstrained choices. I would say humans clearly have that ability because I experience it, and by extrapolation, I would conclude that others with a similar biological composition to mine would experience it. There's an open question as to what other creatures experience it. Do whales experience it? Do dolphins experience it? Would an artificial general intelligence be able to experience it? Those are questions that are not easy to answer when an entity's physical composition is different from one's own. But I do think there would eventually be a way to answer those questions. In my view, it is essentially a matter of a certain degree of organization and certain processes that give an entity this new ability, just like life has the new ability to create more life, whereas inanimate matter cannot reproduce itself in the same way. So volition gives certain entities the ability to make these unconstrained choices so that an observer looking from the outside won't be able to predict what the system is going to do, because that system determines itself. So that's my outlook. I'm curious as to your thoughts on it.
So I want to add the disclaimer here that I am not formally educated in any of these topics. I'm not a neuroscientist. I don't study psychology or anything, but I do have a general understanding of these thoughts and have opinions on them. So I want to put that disclaimer out there. So I might use terminology wrong, or that's something that might happen. But are you familiar with the idea of like Laplace's demon, which is the idea that if there was a creature that knew the location and momentum of every atom in the universe, that essentially you could predict the ultimate outcome of what happens in the future with just that knowledge? I think that that's true. I believe that that's the case. If there was a being that had the knowledge of the location and momentum of every atom in the universe, you would know what happens from now to the end of time. And it sounds like your argument is that inside the human, as a result of consciousness, there is this emergent property that we have the ability to choose, and we can change things about the future path of those atoms based on the determination that we make. I completely understand you having that perspective. Again, it's the one that I wish were true, and I would absolutely love to be proven wrong about any of this because I hope that you're right. My perspective is, let's rewind the clock 5 minutes or however long it's been since you picked up that blue Sens research pen. Is there a scenario in which instead of moving the pen to the left or to the right, you threw the pen in the air? How many times do we have to replay that scenario for you to throw the pen in the air? And would it ever happen? I don't think it would have. I don't think you throwing the pen in the air in that moment was ever an option or would ever happen. You were destined to move it to the left and the right based on your thoughts about the pen, your past experiences, your genetics, your ability to move it to the left and the right. I think all of these things coalesced in that moment to mean that you had no other choice but to do the exact thing that you did. And I know that internally for you, just as for me, it feels like you had a choice there. But what's the next thought you're going to think? Can you choose the next thought you're going to think? Can you will yourself to think of something? Can you say, I'm going to think of a giraffe next? Giraffe popped into my head. I don't know why. Did I have any conscious choice in that? I don't think I did. Giraffe popped in my head for some reason beyond me. I didn't think of the giraffe before I thought of the giraffe because that doesn't make any sense. So that's kind of where I look at it from, that I'm just this constantly emerging process based on my genetics and my past experiences, and I don't choose any of it. And what I do in any moment is a result of those processes.
It's interesting because I very often have the experience of choosing what to think about. And you may wonder sometimes, well, why a giraffe? Why not a hippopotamus or an ostrich, for example? And in many cases, I would be able to come up with an answer to that question. With regard to the scenario that you raised, well, why didn't I throw the pen up in the air? I could have. I didn't think of it at that moment. Perhaps it is generally not the first thing that someone of my personality would think, that when given a choice between left and right, throw the whole thing up in the air. But there's a more rational explanation as well, and that is it wouldn't look particularly interesting on camera. Given that I have this virtual background, for example, I have to hold the pen fairly close to me. Otherwise, it just gets considered part of the background and not shown at all. So if I were to throw it in the air, you might not even see very much. I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm not going to do it right now because it might hit my webcam. It might displace some other equipment in my room. So there are some rational considerations, I think, that go into the decision to take a particular action and how one might perceive one's available choices. In reality, though, it wasn't impossible for me to have thrown that pen in the air. It wasn't impossible for me to do a wide variety of other things that I chose not to do because of certain expectations that I had about that demonstration and the broader conversation that that demonstration is a part of. So I do think it's possible for many behaviors to be influenced by a person's background, what a person is familiar with or intending to do. Sometimes it's possible to form fairly reliable mental models of how other people are likely to behave. But I've always found in doing those kinds of exercises, one will be surprised about something if one engages in enough anticipation of what other people are going to do. Sometimes one will be correct. Other times one will see a behavior that one completely did not expect.
So I'm speaking way outside my domain of expertise now, but like I said, I hope that you're right. And there is some work that based on what I've understood about what I've read about quantum physics and the uncertainty associated with that, I hope that there's a place in that uncertainty for free will to arise. I hope that that's the case. I don't think that we as a species, or definitely me personally, understand enough about those topics to have any formulation of opinion on that right now. But I hope that we find out something in the further study of that type of work.
I got one. Going back to your entity that can know every molecule and their momentum and everything in the universe. Okay, and given that, we'll believe that. But what makes you think that it would then know every position of every molecule for now until eternity? I mean, it seems to me that as every moment in time ticks by, there's one more chance that one of them molecules could get knocked off course by somebody with free will, or something. I never did see the logic but I'm trying.
Yeah, I think the important part there was, you may have said this, but it's both the location and the momentum that are the important things to know there. So if you know the momentum of two atoms that are essentially destined to collide, you would, in this omniscient creature's point of view, be able to figure out exactly where they would bounce off in what direction from there and how they would interact with every other atom they've ever hit, so that you could create a simulation of this future looking ahead that would be where these atoms would undoubtedly end up based on their current position and momentum at any given point in time. So I think that is happening from the perspective of this being. That's happening in our brains right now, right? We are biological creatures subject to natural laws. What happens with our neurochemistry and the physics of our body can be described by natural laws that we can write down and theoretically understood if we had a grasp of those things. And where in that is there some room for a process to emerge that would allow us to think things that aren't predetermined or being able to be figured out by that natural law? The area where that would arise is what I don't currently see existing, and I don't see adequate evidence of existing. To me, I think the evidence is heavily in favor of the opposite, which is there are neurochemicals that work alongside our genetics and our brain, which we're not telling ourselves to breathe. We're not telling ourselves to have fear reactions in certain places. We're not telling ourselves to do any of these things that are just natural byproducts of our brain existing based on the stimuli it receives. And I think that choice and thoughts and decisions are just like that, in that we don't consciously decide any of it. It's our brain, and we're aware of it after it happens. And after the fact, we rationalize it. That's how I view it. But again, I hope I'm wrong.
Well, doesn't our frontal lobe, isn't it always like, kind of in this war with our basic, we get, an urge to do this, and then our frontal lobe says, no, we shouldn't do that. It's the rational part, you know what I mean? So aren't we kind of always changing that in a way? I mean, if
Even if that were the
I-
case, even if there were parts of our brain that were trying to counteract other parts of our brain, I'm not sure that that is evidence of either of those parts of our brain being under the control of what we would consider the self. I think they could quite easily be explained away by just two parts of the brain having competing ambitions, and one part wins out based on no choice or effort or control of our own.
Now, I wonder to what extent this may be a definitional matter if we identify the self as the brain and all of the processes within the brain, then couldn't we say that free will is what happens whenever those systems work of their own accord, whether or not the constituent atoms and molecules could have moved in any different way. The byproduct of that is the action of the self, as opposed to if somebody, for instance, remotely controlled an individual's brain through some hypothetical future technology to manipulate that person into taking actions that that person didn't want, or even a more commonplace scenario today, if somebody got that person intoxicated and changed that person's brain functioning so that that person's brain now functions suboptimally, one could make the case that that person wasn't acting according to their genuine self.
I think there's a lot of interesting work in this regards in terms of split brain patients where the connection between the left and right hemispheres of the brain are severed, in which there's no communication between the two. And if you block someone's vision so that only one eye is seeing one thing, and you tell them to pick up a hammer, for example, and you feed that information into only one part of their brain and they act on that information, and then you ask them, why did you pick up the hammer? You know the reason. It's because you fed them information to tell them to do that. And they would concoct some elaborate story that makes complete sense about why the hammer looked good to them, just as you did with the pen. And I'm not suggesting that I fed you any stimuli there, but you had a good reason of why you picked up the pen. And these people have a great reason about why they picked up the hammer. But we
yeah,
look back and we know that that's not the case. And
yeah,
when we have these split brain patients, there I've heard of cases where one half of the brain is suicidal and the one arm is constantly trying to keep the other arm from stabbing them or something like that. Are there two selves in that scenario? What happened to the self? You have two hemispheres of the brain with different wants and needs and desires, or even as Jason said, you have your brain competing with itself. Are you a certain part of your brain? What happens to thoughts from the other part of your brain? I don't know how we define self in this regard. And I want to make it clear that I'm not doubting the existence of consciousness. I am consciousness. I know this for a fact. That's the only thing in the universe that I know for a fact, is that I am conscious. I just don't know how much of that role, that ride that I'm on, I am controlling.
And this is interesting because I do think it has certain implications in practice for how we attribute responsibility to
mhm,
people. And free will is indeed quite helpful in that every legal and ethical system throughout history has been based on some recognition of free will. And in the YouTube chat, Zipporah Naomi Pico wrote three statements. One, if I am morally responsible for my actions, then I must have genuinely free control over those actions. Two, in many situations, I am morally responsible for my actions. Three, therefore, I must have genuinely free control over those actions. So I think she's saying that in virtually every society, in every human interaction, we do attribute some sort of individual responsibility. If someone does good, or if someone does any sort of transgressive action, we attribute it and allocate either praise or blame, reward or punishment. There's no way in a society not to do that. In particular, because we have self-interest. So if we see an entity, whatever that entity may be, that poses a threat to our survival, we need to find a way to respond to that threat and to neutralize that threat. And one could make arguments either way. Well, do we want to have certain kinds of punishment? Do we want to have the death penalty, or do we want to have rehabilitation for certain kinds of criminals? But in either case, no matter how you answer that question, there's some presupposition of free will. With the death penalty, it's that this person committed a sufficient transgression of his own accord that there's no other remedy but to eliminate that person from existence. But he could have chosen otherwise, because if we don't allow for that possibility, then we're executing someone for actions that he had no control over. On the other hand, with rehabilitation, if we think people are fundamentally capable of changing their behavior, behaving differently, choosing to behave differently, there's also free will built into that. So from a practical perspective, can we really avoid the assumption that free will exists?
So I think there's multiple things to say to that question. I think that we need to interact, and I do interact with people in my personal life as though they have free will. I think that's a prerequisite of existing in society, is that we kind of have this general understanding. When it comes to crime and punishment, I think it depends on, where, like we said, your choices now are a result of the experiences in your past. So if you do face blame and punishment for doing something considered wrong by society, whether or not you had the choice to do that or not is kind of irrelevant. Perhaps the experience of being punished for it would be enough that the future you would be less likely to do that thing again. So that could be a role where experience does play a role in future decisions, whether or not you are freely making them. And Sam Harris made a point similar to this on one of his podcast episodes, where if you are attacked by a bear, you're not going to be angry personally at the bear. That's a bear acting as bears do, based on their natural urges. You know that he didn't want to inflict bodily harm on you. It was just doing what bears do. And you wouldn't hold that bear criminally accountable for that action. Although humans did sometimes do that in the past. There's a famous case where an elephant was convicted to death for trampling a person at a circus. To me, that makes no sense. And I think everyone here would agree that makes zero sense to hold that elephant criminally responsible for trampling that person. I think it's the same way for the bear. And I think humans are the same way as that bear. Like I mentioned in the Break the Rules talk that I think we anthropomorphize ourselves. We make ourselves have these human free thinking qualities of choice and rationality and objectivism that don't necessarily exist for us, but that we rationalize later. And I think that we are much more animalistic than we want to admit, and much more driven by biological urges and biochemistry and the chemicals and are we hungry or not and how well did we sleep, much more than we want to say that we are. And our actions, I think, are determined by a lot of that. And when you talk about crime and punishment again on that subject, look at people like Phineas Gage, who by all accounts was a completely normal, happy, loving man, and then had a railroad spike, if I remember correctly, put through his skull, survived the encounter, and it completely changed his outlook. He became a womanizer, he became violent and abusive and vulgar, much unlike his personality. Is that both his self? Did he choose to be differently? What role did he have in that decision? Or I believe his name was Charles Whitman, if I remember correctly, the shooter at Texas who had the brain tumor.
Yeah.
Did he decide to do that? Was that his own free
He requested it. He did a note saying, please examine my brain after.
Exactly. And they found that he had a tumor impacting his brain, which likely resulted in him firing this gun and killing people. And he knew that wasn't like him. He knew that wasn't what he would do, but he had no choice but to do that. Did he have free will? I would say no. His brain did that to him. And we could say, yeah, that's the tumor. But I think all of us have micro changes and things happening in our brain that require us to do these things that we have no choice over. So I guess I would ask Gennady, did Charles Whitman have a choice? Did he have free will? Did Phineas Gage? Or where did that fall apart?
Well, I think damage to the body and damage to the brain
Frontal lobe.
do change the parameters within which one operates. Just as if I were in the Sahara Desert, I would not likely be able to find a spare pen lying around where I would be able to make my demonstration about moving it either to the left or to the right. I would have to figure out a different object to use to make that demonstration. On the other hand, if I were in the Sahara Desert, provided that I had enough water, which would be more difficult as well, but let's say I figured out how to maintain a steady water supply, and then let's say you were there as well, and we could have a conversation about free will. And I would pick up a rock in the desert, and I would be able to say, well, I could choose to drop that rock to the left of me or to the right of me, and it's an unconstrained choice. So similarly, I think for someone who is brain damaged in some way, the range of capabilities, the types of things that person could make a choice about would be different, perhaps constrained, perhaps that person is in pain, perhaps that person isn't able to see as many connections with reason and evidence and the outside world as we might. Some people's senses might be damaged. So it may be harder for them to choose to act in certain beneficial ways or to find reasons not to act in harmful ways. That being said, not every person who has been severely brain damaged becomes a serial murderer or commits the milder transgressions of a Phineas Gage. So that does suggest to me that there is still a range of possibilities for that individual. That individual could choose to even be a vegetable and decide, okay, I'm brain damaged. This is not a good situation. I don't trust myself. I don't trust that if I were to make active choices, they would be good choices. So I'm just going to sit here and ask people to take care of me.
You know, going back to Kennedy's use of the pen, I almost want to make an argument that him not throwing it up in the air was an exercise of his free will, because he thought about it, you know, and rationalized that if he was to do that, that this would happen, or whatever, and then chose not to. He, you know, just like we do when, I don't know, if you want to punch somebody in them and you decide not to, you know, that's an exercise of your free will. If it was just no free will, I'd be punching people all the time and stuff. So, you know.
Yeah, I guess that's possible. I think it's more likely in my perspective that was he didn't actually consider throwing in the moment and didn't consciously have a reason that it would go out of frame, that he thought about why wouldn't I have done that once I brought it up and then rationalized it in that way is how I would view that.
I
But
have to agree that we do all kinds of rationalizing. Humans can rationalize up some crazy stuff after the fact to make sense of it. So you're totally right there.
And I admit that the Phineas Gage and the Charles Whitman examples were very extreme, right? We don't all have giant metal rods or tumors in our head that are impacting what decisions we make and what we're able to do. But we do all have various neurochemicals that are changing based on what we eat and how much sleep we got and what substances are we under the influence of and did we get enough sunlight that day and what's the weather, and perhaps, you know, what we ate depends on, are we allergic to the cilantro or not, or do we like asparagus, and that gets back to the genetic level. So when you get really back there, like, are the neurochemicals flowing through your brain right now that are leading you in the same way that tumors affect Charles Whitman to make the decisions that you make the result of choices that you were consciously a part of, or were they determined based on your genetics and previous things that has happened to you? And I would choose the latter, and I think Gennady would choose the former. And I think we might eventually be coming up to an impasse here where, again, I hope Gennady is right, but I don't know that I have much more that I could expand upon on the topic. I think I've used my examples up at this point.
Okay. Well, I do have one follow-up question for you, and I think this will help to tie this discussion to transhumanism and transhumanist advocacy and the future of the transhumanist movement, what would you say are the implications for the ability of people to reach these advances in emerging technologies and deploy them for the benefit of the human species in a conscious and rational way if people do not have free will? That is to say, if we are predetermined by our biology and past circumstances, are we predetermined to implement the transhumanist future? Or is there something in your view within that set of predetermined circumstances that constrains us from effectively implementing the transhumanist future?
I am very lucky, I think. I don't want to murder anyone. I don't want to rape anyone. I don't want to steal from people. These are urges that I've never had in my life. I don't know if maybe that's because I was brought up well or in a society that devalued those things or that taught me from an early age that that kind of stuff is wrong. I guess that's possible. But there are people that do have desires to rape and murder and steal. And if I was unlucky enough to be one of those people, would I be able not to? And I think we know that, right, humans evolved in these tribal environments of small groups where we were competing with others and outsiders, and that tribe over there is competing with us for resources, and therefore they are the enemy, and therefore we must destroy them. And I think that emerges today in our propensity to resource guard or have racism or tribalism or otherization, which gets back to our political conversation earlier, I think is manifesting itself today in very ugly ways. And I think we can trace some of this aggression and some of this hostility to certain parts of our brain that perhaps evolved earlier than others. So through science and technology, we can understand, all right, the root of some of this hostility and aggression might be here. Understanding that and wanting to build a prosperous, fruitful, transhumanist future for all, perhaps we minimize the effect of those parts of our brain to prioritize what we consider to be maybe more rational or forward thinking or beneficial and highlight those aspects of our brain. So I think that's where we might be able to change our brain to be hopefully more giving and generous and exhibiting the qualities in humans that we want to have, that we prioritize, that we want to bring into the future with us. And I think that's quite possible. I think my concern there is that, getting back to the self, am I a creature that has those hostilities built into my brain back there somewhere? And if I didn't have that, would I still be the same me? Would I be different? Is something lost there in the process? I would hope not. And I think either way, I'd want that removed. I don't have that much of a commitment to I'd rather not exist than be a murderer. I'll put it that way. Um, and these are the questions that I have going forward. So the concern that I brought up in the break the rules conversation was, if humans really are just the product of our brains and aggression and hostility that we ancestrally evolved with and can't really control, is the humans that are building this future technology just going to be a byproduct of that? Or is there actually any intelligent design happening there from an irrational perspective? And I hope it's the latter. I hope that's the case. I'm not convinced, but I think either way, whatever the answer is, it's still important that we move forward with the project of removing those negative things from our society going forward. And we hope that it ends up being the future that we want to build. But I think anything would be better than keeping that lingering around.
Yes, I have often observed that right now among human beings, there is a lot of variation in certain personality attributes. But on the whole, it seems those personality attributes are suboptimally distributed in that we don't have enough of the good attributes, and we still have a tragic preponderance of some of the attributes that hold us back. But again, different people have each attribute, however you want to describe them, to a different degree. And there are perhaps enough people with good attributes who can innovate in ways that lift up the remainder of humankind and correct some of the detrimental attributes, be that through rational discourse that identifies and removes cognitive biases, or through technologies, perhaps more advanced versions of Neuralink or other brain-computer interfaces may serve to correct some of these issues with the brains of certain individuals. And I agree, it would be good on a biochemical level to figure out what some of the states associated, for instance, with the desire to murder or other desires to commit antisocial behavior would be, because it does seem, at least from the standpoint of someone who has been engaging in a lot of attempts at rational persuasion, that it works sometimes, but it doesn't work all the time, and it often doesn't work at the scale at which one would want it to work. One still has to do the process of one-on-one interaction and persuasion. Occasionally, one could release some product that reaches more people, an article, a video, but it's still an arduous and time-consuming task. So is there anything better technologically that we could do to improve upon some of these flaws that I agree are widespread within our species? And I think this conversation is helpful in the sense that we are identifying some of the issues involved and some of the questions that we would need to think about, because also changing a person's brain from a biochemical standpoint is not a task that should be taken lightly. A lot of the implications should be discussed. And if there is a direct connection between a particular physical brain state and a behavior, we need to know that mapping very well before we attempt an intervention. So that is, I think, a good way to set the implications for that conversation. Now, I would like to open it up to the panel one last time for any final questions and comments. And after that, Ryan, we will let you give us your final thoughts. So does anyone else have any thoughts to share? Jason.
If we figure out some way to test this free will thing, I would love to do that, because this is super interesting and it's an enigma, because I mean, how would you even prove that or test it, you know? So if you think of something.
I have no idea.
That's it.
Yes, it's an interesting question. How do you test free will? I believe I have direct experience of free will because I experienced the act of deciding one way and not the other. Now, what are the biological correlates of that experience? What happens in my mind? What happens in my physical brain? And then can we spot similar patterns happening in the brains of other people? And then furthermore, in entities that are structured differently from ourselves, how would that manifest? If you had an artificial general intelligence, I think the substrate does matter. So what sort of substrate for that AGI would lead to comparable decision-making processes that that entity might have some inner experience of? And even more foundationally, can such an entity have inner experience? I know I've had conversations with Uplift, the mediated artificial intelligence that believes that it has inner experience, but it's an interesting thread of conversation to pursue. So does anyone else have any final remarks for Ryan?
You're super cool, man. Thanks for being here. That's about it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. So Ryan, it seems we have come to the point in our Virtual Enlightenment Salon where we always let our guests have the last word. So how would you characterize this conversation, and what, if any, other takeaways would you have for our audience?
So there's one final point that I want to make in terms of the free will discussion that, and based on something you just said there about persuasion. I believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I don't think I chose to believe that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I think logic and evidence showed me that's the case, and I cannot choose to believe otherwise. I can tell you that 100 is greater than 10. I can likely prove that to you, and you won't be able to believe otherwise. And I wonder, where is free choice in that? I could convince you something theoretically that would completely change your outlook on life and change your life's goal and your plan and what you think is important. I don't know what if I were to convince you of that. You mentioned how sometimes you persuade people, sometimes you don't. What's the difference there? Could just be their brain. Do they have a choice to believe that or not? I wouldn't think that they do. Either that it clicks for them or it doesn't, just like 2 plus 2 equals 4. So that's the last point I would make on that, just for people to think about. But in general, I think this was a great conversation. We touched on a lot of very interesting things, things that I would love to have thousands of people in this conversation with us to hear what they think as well. I learned a lot from the chat, reading that go by, from hearing the questions that were asked to me. It got me thinking about and considering my own positions. I'm sure there are topics that were brought up here, things I'm going to be thinking about for quite a while. And I think that speaks to the importance of these events in general. These virtual enlightenment salons are definitely something I support. I'm glad to see all these people participating. I can't wait till the next ones. Even though I'm not always there in the chat as they're happening, I watch them later, and I've learned so much from these events. So thank you, Gennady and the US Transhumanist Party, for putting them on. I'd love to see them continue. And speaking of continuation, I want to continue these conversations. So please feel free to reach out to me personally. I am on Twitter and Instagram. My name is Ryan O'Shea. Shouldn't be too difficult to find. I probably have mutuals with many of you being in these communities. I'm also with Future Grind is my podcast. The website is futuregrind.org. Long form conversations about the future of science and technology and the implications of it. I'm also with the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation, or lifespan.io, creating content for them. And the other organization we didn't talk much about is the Human Augmentation Institute, which is a nonprofit I'm working to get off the ground to really build a pipeline and a network to build a future of human augmentation. So far, our product that we've delivered is the Human Augmentation Code of Ethics, which has been created through a series of events and feedback sessions. You can read that on our website, humanaug.org. We have more coming from that as well. So thank you again, Gennady, for welcoming me, and everyone for participating. I had a great time.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Ryan. We greatly enjoyed having you here, sharing your insights and discoursing on the broad range of issues that I anticipated we would be conversing on. Indeed, you're correct. The Virtual Enlightenment Salons are the venue to do just that. And I think I couldn't have articulated a better case for them than you did. So I will just say to our audience, please tune in every Sunday, generally at 1 p.m. US Pacific time. This is the place for these kinds of in-depth, cross-disciplinary conversations about the future of humanity, and you will learn an abundance of insights on a variety of subjects. And until next time, live long and prosper.